Good morning. It's good to see everyone. First and foremost, I know I haven't necessarily addressed you probably since the first day, but I want to offer my sincere appreciation and thanks for the job that you all have done, both here in this building and the two elementary buildings that are joining us live back at their buildings. I know that we are all creatures of habit, that we know we have to see things done. We learn best by, others showing us or doing, and a pandemic does not allow us to have some kind of guidebook or textbook or whatever with the directions on how to deal with it. I think, Mr. Dale, 1918? The last major pandemic in the United States. Nobody's around that lived through that to tell us, hey, this is how we taught. And even then, what good would that do, right? And so, it's a trial and error. And I cannot thank you enough for the job that you've done. I get no complaints whatsoever about your efforts and how you're dealing with kids. And that says a lot about you at all three buildings. It's a difficult task. It's stressful. Trust me. I've never been the one to be real skinny, but you could tell by since, the COVID-20 probably, or it's not in the 19, it's 20 or 25, because the stress I eat, I don't know what Miller and Compton do. They never gain weight at all. When you have Compton's job, I don't know, it's easy street for him. So anyway, but in all honesty, as we keep moving forward, I wish I could tell you it's going to get better and we're going to know what plan we have in place. But I think if anything, we know that nothing out there that we don't know what's coming. I can tell you that I am happy that we're sitting here with all three buildings with fully staffed and kids in the buildings. And that's the goal. And I think that even at that, though, it still presents challenges for every building and how we do things. We still have remote learners. We still have kids on quarantine. We have teachers on quarantine. But overall, what we've done and how we've done it, it has been great. And I tell people, Kevin's first question is how it's been. And you know what? We knew there would be headaches, and there have been, but outside, it has not been as bad as I thought it could have been. And okay, that's easy for you, Rob, that you're not in the cloud, but honestly, you all have done a great job in all three buildings, and I just want to tell you that. And if there's ever anything that you need or have ideas, obviously, I've never lived through it. The principals have never lived through it. We've never, we don't have all the answers. If you have things that you think can be improved upon, we're always going to listen to you. So thank you. As far as the setup this morning, Mr. Foxworthy and Kyle, I appreciate their help. This is being streamed through Teams. At the elementary level, they should be logged on to question and answer. The icon there, I think it's over towards the far right. And then they're going to be able to ask questions that Tricia and I will then present to Kevin if they have them so that they can participate. In here, if you have the questions for Kevin, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask him. A lot of you remember Kevin from last year, and you know that it's valuable time spent with him. So, without further ado, I'm excited to have Kevin return. I know we have new people in here, so just a little bit about Kevin. He served as a special education teacher, public school principal, and director of special education. As an accomplished and renowned educator and popular speaker, he offers practical instructional strategies to help all students learn. He's known across the country for his innovative and research-based strategies. I dislike masks as much as most of you. Designed to eliminate chronic disruptive behavior and improve student performance in the classroom. He's a specialist in the area of student behavior with over 20 years of teaching experience. He's authored several educational resources, including the most powerful solutions to eliminating chronic disruptive behavior in your classroom. So, please welcome Kevin Dill back to Western Boone Schools. Morning,
Thanks,
Kevin.
Rob. Good morning. So let's do a sound check. Can you hear me? And are you guys comfortable enough in the front row with my mask being off? Okay, so if you're not, you can move. That's fine. No, I'm just kidding. I can put my mask on. So it's good to be back. Let's do a sound check with people joining us remotely. Can they hear me? Can they see me? Can anybody check? Just want to make sure. Are you doing the question and answer?
Yeah, I'm not getting a response right now. So go ahead and we'll
Okay. So hopefully they can see my fat face. That's the most important thing, because
I can see the screen clearly, so I think they probably
oh, you can see my fat face. Okay, so that's good. All right. There I am. All right. So, yeah, Rob stole my thunder. I was going to talk about COVID-19. It's the 19 pounds that I've gained. It's good to be back. You know, Western Boone County, when I was driving up here this morning, it reminds me a lot of Tremont, my neck of the woods. Tremont is a rural setting, kind of a small town setting just west of here in Illinois, central Illinois. It's about 2.5 hours. Anybody know where Tremont is? Anybody been? Yeah, you know, have you been to Tremont?
I went to college in Illinois, real close to Tremont.
Okay, where at?
East Peoria.
Oh, yeah. All right. Bradley?
ICC.
ICC, yeah. All right. All right, very good. So Tremont is, it reminds me a lot. When I pulled up to this school, it just brought back a lot of memories, and I lived there. In fact, I was talking to Rob this morning. They are having in-person learning, so students are back in class, and they're navigating through this very well. I was the principal there for a number of years, and if you would visit Tremont School District and go into some of the schools like Tremont Elementary School, you'd find pretty typical, normal, average school. Great people, great teachers, great paraprofessionals, people who have big hearts, who want to make an impact on kids. And a few years ago, if you would have visited, you would have found something really special there, an outlier at Tremont Elementary School. One classroom that would have just blown you away, and that's a first grade classroom taught by Kelly Brabson. Kelly Brabson is one of the probably masterful level teachers that I have ever had an opportunity to work with and teach with. Most years, Kelly would have about 20 to 25 kids in her first grade class. Most years they were average academic achievement, average cognitive ability, and most years it was average behavior. Nothing that a teacher like Kelly or you couldn't handle, some compliance issues. But one particular year, Kelly had a really challenging class. Very challenging class. I mean, the behaviors went beyond the typical non-compliance, sort of into defiance, but it went into egregious type of behaviors. There was some bullying, some aggression. Just think about a normal faculty meeting. And that's, no, I'm just kidding. I just want you to laugh a little bit. But it went into some aggression and some bullying. She had some really strong-willed students in there. In particular, there was one strong-willed student. Her name was Maddie. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about, I want you to picture Maddie in your mind's eye. Maddie was a cute little girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and she had this little raspy voice as a first grader. Very strong-willed. Now, here's the reason I'm telling you this. There's a difference between being a strong-willed student, being a maladaptive student, and being a student who comes from trauma. And Maddie was a strong-willed student. To give you an idea, we were in our second year of PBIS, Positive Behavioral Intervention Support System, as a school, and I had this sort of ritual. It was customary that students could say jokes on the morning announcements, but there was a protocol to that. The protocol was that you had to write out your joke, or you had to have somebody write out your joke. You had to give it to my secretary, Jill Hellriggle. She had to screen it, and then she would put your name down and a date of when you could say it on the announcements. And then I would screen it just to make sure it was okay, right, that we didn't miss anything. So for weeks during lunchroom supervision, Maddie would come up to me and ask me if she could say a joke on the announcements. And I would say, Maddie, I would ask her, did you talk to Mrs. Hellriggle? Did you give your joke to Mrs. Hellriggle? And of course she didn't. I said, well, you got to give your joke to Mrs. Hellriggle. for weeks. Well, Maddie was smart, and she recognized that we had our PBIS celebrations. We called them turkey ticket celebrations because we're the Tremont Turks. Turkey ticket celebrations once a month on a Friday afternoon. And I would always have students kick off the celebration by highlighting a talent of theirs, if they wanted to say jokes, if they wanted to play an instrument, just for a few minutes. So Maddie picked up on that. And so instead of asking me if she could say a joke on the announcements, Maddie came up and we were trying to dismiss kids to get them out to recess. So it was a little bit chaotic if you've ever been in lunchroom supervision. And Maddie came up to me and asked, can I say a joke during the next turkey ticket celebration? And I was kind of in a rush and I said, yeah, Maddie, let's get out to recess. Totally forgot about it. So the next turkey ticket celebration during the next month, the Friday afternoon from 2 to 2:30, right at 2 o'clock, all the kids were lined up, sitting in the cafetorium, ready to go with the program, and I get up to the microphone like this, and I see Maddie pop up from her row and come bebopping down to the microphone, and she comes up to me, and I said, Maddie, what do you want? We got to get started on the celebration. And she said, you said I could say a joke at the next turkey ticket celebration. And I thought, yeah, I did. I said, okay, Maddie, here's the deal. One joke, and then we got to get going. So I said, all right, everybody, Maddie's going to kick our celebration off with telling us a joke, and of course I'm sort of sweating bullets a little bit, and you know what's coming, right? Because I didn't screen the joke. And here was Maddie's first joke. Hey everybody, you know why God made your butt crack this way and not that way? So when you go down a slide, you don't go and so Brabson's in the back going, like, cut her off. Maddie was a strong-willed student. Kelly Brabson also had my daughter, Kennedy. And if you remember last time, I introduced my family to you. This is my family. If you remember, it's my wife, Jody. This is my son, Cole, our son, Cole, and our twin daughters, Kennedy and Cassidy. Kennedy is in the brown, Cassidy is in the yellow. And I introduced you to Kennedy last time when I was here because we were talking about maladaptive students. Maladaptive students are different than strong-willed students. And if you're a trauma-skilled teacher, you'll begin to understand the difference of what's strong-willed, what's maladaptive, and what's a student who comes from trauma. Cole was what I call, and still call, an always kid. And there's a lot left in the world, and you probably have some in your class, or your classes. I call them an always kid because they're neurotypically developing. They're always doing the right thing. They always have their homework done, they always study for their tests, they're always compliant. These kids we don't have to pour a lot of time and energy into. And that's our son Cole. Kennedy and Cassidy have been really interesting to watch develop and grow up because they're mirror image twins. And if you know what a mirror image twin is, a mirror image twin is when they look at each other, it's like they're looking into a mirror. If one of them has a cavity on this side bottom row, the other one will have a cavity on the opposite side bottom row. By the way, their ABCs, their attitude, behavior, and their character are opposite as well. Cassidy is what I call a sometimes kid, and you'll have a lot of these in your class and in your classes. A sometimes kid is a kid who sometimes they have their homework done, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have material, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're on time for class, sometimes they're not. The danger about a sometimes kid in terms of behavior is they fly under the radar. They're not the frequent flyers to the office. And by the way, they drive teachers crazy sometimes. Because you think, you know how to do this, right? They're called the sometimes kids. A lot of the strategies that we'll talk about today will help with the sometimes kids. And then you have my daughter, Kennedy, who Kelly Brabson had in her class, thank goodness. She was a phenomenal teacher. Kennedy is what I call a never kid. And if you remember last time, a never kid is a kid who is never compliant. They're never safe. They're never responsible. They never have their homework done. They never study for their tests. And if you ever notice, they're never absent either. They're like always there, right? They are the never kids. These are the kids that are maladaptive. Yes, they are strong-willed, but they are different in their thinking patterns than a strong-willed student. So we have a strong-willed student, and we have maladaptive students like my daughter Kennedy. And now today we're going to talk about students who are exposed to developmental trauma. Well, there's an update to our family. If you remember last time, I showed you a picture of our family, and Kennedy didn't have anybody standing next to her in terms of relationship. And As of this summer, Kennedy got engaged to her fiance Scott, and they're going to be married next year. And as you can tell, coming from a father of a never student, I am pretty happy on their engagement day. I haven't been that happy, Rob, since, I don't know, Krispy Kreme had a 2-for-1 sale. I'm a pretty happy guy. So the reason for that is that maladaptive students have a really difficult time with relationships. They have a really, really difficult time with social emotional competence. And for her to be able to maintain a job and to have a relationship with somebody, and hopefully a long-lasting relationship, is a miracle. So I introduced this to you last time, and I want to remind you of this. There's no formula for compliance. There's no formula for compliance. In fact, if there was a formula for compliance, for training for compliance, that'd be wonderful for all of us teachers, but there's not. Instead, we have to look at a hybrid approach. There's a framework that we know that is very effective for dealing with kids who are not only strong-willed, also maladaptive, and now when we talk about students who come from trauma. And that's this framework, and it has 3 buckets or 3 components. The first one is this: it's behavior development. And what I mean by behavior development is this: be a behavior farmer. Being a behavior farmer means you're constantly working on growing good behavior. And you're always working on that. But in that bucket, what's in that bucket is training for compliance, not demanding submission. And that'll be a really important strategy when we talk about kids who come from trauma. The second component of that is working on motivation. The reason we have to work on motivation is because these kids start to have a script in their head called the value script, the worthiness script, which we'll start to learn about later on. So be a behavior farmer. That's really what we talked about last time. If you remember, we talked about staying out of traps, understanding tactics, our approach to students, and how we approach them, being balanced with that. But there's also another component. I call this being a chicken psychologist, or knowing chicken psychology. And the reason I call it knowing chicken psychology is that even barnyard chickens have a level of social emotional competence. Did you know this, that they have empathy for one another? They have a low level of empathy. They understand the pecking order, which means they understand social awareness. Some of the maladaptive kids that we have in our classes don't even have that level of social emotional competence. So not only are you teaching the subject areas, the content areas, you're also being a chicken psychologist, blending in some of these social emotional competencies. And today what we're going to talk about, for the most part, is this big area called brain integration. And that's really thinking about being a brain builder. When you think about brain integration, and I'm going to get a little bit deep into what that is, it's really about a horizontal and vertical integration of the brain. So here's the key to this. Most districts will focus on one of these in isolation, but they won't focus and work on all 3 simultaneously. The way you have to envision this is that these are 3 magic elixirs that you're mixing together into sort of a magic potion. And then when you mix them together, what happens is you start to move the needle on the ABCs, the attitude, the behavior, and the character of a student. Because if you just work on behavior compliance, but you don't also work on social emotional competence, and you don't also work on integration, you're going to be missing 2 key components of this equation. So again, there's no magic formula, but there is a framework that we know is effective. And by the way, when you're trying to develop solutions for students who have really challenging behaviors, your solutions will come out of these 3 buckets, if that makes sense. When I went to Duren Middle School, if you pull up into the parking lot, it looked like a rundown school. I mean, the HVAC systems that were on the roof and on the ground were rusty. There was grass growing up through the cracks of the parking lot. When I walked into the school, it was like I walked into a state nursing home and a state-run prison at the same time. It kind of smelled, and it was dark and dingy. There were not a lot of displays in the hallways. It wasn't bright. When passing periods would occur, it was crazy in the hallways. People were cussing at each other. They were throwing things at each other. They were running down the hallways. They were jumping on each other. They were hitting each other. And then, Rob, I always say when the bell rang and the kids went out in the hallway, it was even worse. It was terrible. No, but it was chaotic. This was an upside-down school. Duren Middle School was in Savannah, Georgia, by the way. And Duren Middle School was an upside-down school, which means that if you look at their KPIs, they're upside down. KPIs are key performance indicators. All the things that should have been going up, like attendance rates and graduation rates and all of those things, were going down. And those things that should have been going down, like exclusionary practices and suspensions, expulsions, those were going up. So we had an upside-down school. I spent 3 days at Duren Middle School and went through every nook and cranny of that school, sat in every classroom, went to the cafeteria during lunch, went to extracurricular activities, rode on the buses. And I found one classroom that was totally different than the rest, and that's Mr. Brown. And I don't know if the video transferred. I'm going to show you a little clip of Mr. Brown. Hopefully it transferred here. I don't think it did. Oh, shoot, it didn't. All right. I had a little clip of Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was what I call a trauma-skilled teacher. He went further beyond just being trauma-informed. Being trauma-informed understands how trauma impacts brain development, how it impacts behavior. Being trauma-skilled is using solutions and techniques and strategies to navigate through it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I know you're trauma-informed, but I want to move you and nudge you beyond that to be trauma-skilled. Mr. Brown was a trauma-skilled teacher. He had the skills. What Mr. Brown did in his classroom was far beyond a typical classroom at Duren Middle School, and by the way, his KPIs showed that. No kids ever missed his class, ever. Ever. You know why? Because he built up serotonin. Serotonin is the joy chemical. He was way beyond engaging, he was captivating, and kids didn't want to miss that. All kids in his classes were hitting proficiency levels. No kids ever got kicked out, or no kids ever just left voluntarily, just eloped out of the classroom. Why was his class so different than the rest of the classes at Duren Middle School? It's because he was a trauma-skilled teacher. He used the strategies and embedded them in the flow of his instruction. What he focused on were the ABCs, the attitude, the behavior, and the character. And by the way, I spent a couple hours in his classroom and took down some notes for a training like this, and I want to just share a little bit about what he focused on. The first thing he did is he worked on building resilience. He taught social studies, but what he really taught was how kids, a majority of the kids at Duren Middle School in Savannah, Georgia, come from trauma. And what I'm talking about in terms of trauma, and I know Dr. Lori probably talked about it, but just a reminder, it's developmental trauma, not acute trauma. I had acute trauma this year, as many of you. We faced COVID. My dad, on March 30th at 5:30 in the morning, passed away suddenly. My mom, who's 77, went to the hospital because she had a brain tumor in January. That's acute trauma. What I'm talking about is developmental trauma. It's chronic and pervasive, sort of in perpetuity. It happens over and over and over and over. And that's what was happening with students at Duren Middle School. Much different than Maddie, who's the strong-willed student. She doesn't come from trauma. Much different than my daughter Kennedy, who grew up within a loving family, who went to church on Sunday and Wednesday nights, who were a part of civic organizations, who were leaders in the community. Kennedy's a maladaptive student. These kids that I'm going to talk about today are kids exposed to developmental trauma, like my fat stepdad is slipping in my bed at night, that type of thing. Duren Middle School had a lot of those kids, and Mr. Brown focused on helping them build resiliency. You know how he did that? He had to slip in social-emotional learning into his lessons. Duren Middle School in Savannah Chatham School District had no clue about a social-emotional learning curriculum. like highly effective habits of teenagers, or second steps, or terrific teachable moments. So Mr. Brown had to develop some SEL lessons and blend them into his lessons to help them build resiliency. He also understood the Pygmalion effect, and this is an important effect for us to understand when we're really teaching kids who come from trauma. The Pygmalion effect, if you remember, and I'll put it in practical terms, is when you have kids walking into your classroom for the first time of the year, and you're looking on the roster, you're saying, okay, there's Joshua, there's Kennedy, oh, there's Tim, and in your mind, you're like, I had your brother. This is not going to be a good year. I know your family. I know where you live. And all of a sudden, you put a cap on a kid. That's the Pygmalion effect. And especially for kids who come from trauma, you have to lift that lid. You cannot have the Pygmalion effect. That's called a bias, right? And we have to take that bias out. He also understood that culture and climate in his classroom are king. Just like in a business, cash is king, in your classroom, culture and climate is absolutely king. You will have to decide, and you probably already have, whether you will have a family-like culture in your classroom or you'll have a business-type culture in your classroom. Those are pretty much the only two. You'll have a family type or you'll have a business type. A family-type culture is you are accepted because you're a human being. A business-type culture, and it exudes from everything you say and do, is you're accepted when you perform. And that's the difference. And you as the teacher have control of that. Brown understood that culture and climate in his classroom were king. They will eat compliance for lunch every day of the week. Use the best compliance strategies you know, but if your climate and culture is off, it'll eat compliance for lunch every day of the week. He did use some compliance strategies. Those are called nudging strategies, which we'll talk about today, and those are important for kids who come from trauma. He also had to work on self-control and regulation with the student. So he embedded a lot of mind-sight activities and mindfulness strategies, and that relates to brain integration, which we'll talk about. Because he had to work on self-control and emotional control. He did use reinforcers and consequences. And here's the big difference. Some teachers don't understand the difference between a reward, a reinforcer, an incentive, and a bribe. And if you don't know the difference between the four, it's a good thing you're here today, because they are different. And when we talk about behavior, we don't talk about a reward system for students. With behavior, we talk about reinforcers. With behavior, we don't talk about punishments, we talk about consequences. Here's the difference. Punishments don't teach anything. Consequences are designed to teach students a skill or a different way to think. And when you're dealing with a student who comes from developmental trauma, you're definitely going to lean on consequences that are designed to change the way they think, because that's important. He also embedded the 3 C's of motivation, which we'll talk about: choice and connectivity and competence within his lessons. He had to fire them up. And I wish I could have shown you that video, because it would have showed you how he fired them up. He embedded in a social emotional learning curriculum. He also created a mentoring program, lunch buddies. For some of his most challenging male students and female students, he hooked them up with a formal mentor. Great for students who come from trauma, and also maladaptive students. And he also began to embed restorative practices like classroom circles, victim offender mediation meetings, and those types of things, which we'll take a look at today. Here's how great of a trauma-skilled teacher he was. When I left his classroom, I turned to the right, walked to the adjacent classroom, and when I walked into that classroom, which was just right next door, it was sort of like walking into the Sierra Desert. It was dry, it was boring, kids had their heads on their desks. You know, you've seen that before. 2 kids got up and walked out voluntarily, 1 kid got kicked out. I found out that that teacher was a demoted principal later on. And I thought to myself, how does that district expect that teacher who's a demoted principal, who can't even lead a building full of adaptive adults, to be leading classrooms full of maladaptive and trauma-exposed students. It was a train wreck. But it gives you an idea. Mr. Brown gives you an idea of sort of where we're heading today, being a trauma-skilled teacher. And if I could just give a quick executive summary of what it means to be trauma-skilled, which is beyond trauma-informed, it includes these. One is being prepared. What do you have to be prepared for? You have to be prepared for tactics and traps. You have to be ready for them, and you have to know how to deal with them because they're coming. If you're dealing with a kid who comes from trauma, you're going to fall into tactics, you're going to fall into traps, and you have to be prepared and ready to go. You have to be equipped. You have to know when to shift. How do I respond to this student as opposed to react to them in terms of their behavior? So you have to know when to shift. You also have to be insightful. So you have to understand their developmental history. You have to understand things like, have they been diagnosed with ODD or DMDD? And you've got to be insightful because that plays into their behavior. And you also have to be committed. And the reason I put being committed is it's messy. It is extremely messy and it's uncomfortable. When you're dealing with a kid who comes from trauma, it's hard to navigate through and it's messy, but you have to be committed. And when you're, like if you do a commitment review conference with a student who comes from trauma, at the end of it, you're going to think, I screwed that whole thing up. That was a disaster. It doesn't feel right, but you have to stay committed for the long run. The other thing is this, you can't rescue them, but you can be a part of the healing process. So be a healer, not a rescuer. Choose relationships over being right. Do not get into power struggles with them. Conflict is inevitable. Combat is optional. Conflict is inevitable. Combat is optional. Choose relationships over being right. You have to use a balance of nurture and structure. We're going to use structure for all kids. But you have to have a balance of that structure with the nurture, and we're going to talk about how that balance is. Understand this is a journey. Think crock pot, not microwave. And what I mean by that, I'm going to get very real today. When a kid's looking at you, calling you a crackhead bitch, and flipping you off because they flipped their lid, this is what I'm talking about. Be a healer, not a rescuer. Choose a relationship over being right. Understand nurture and structure balance, and understand this, that even though you don't want that kid to say that anymore, it's going to take a long time. It doesn't change overnight. In fact, an overnight success with these kids takes about 3 to 5 years, and sometimes a lot longer. It's a crock-pot journey, not a microwave. And that's why our exclusionary practices, like suspensions, detentions, we now have more effective approaches than using those microwave-type strategies. Be intentional about being present with them. What I mean by that, it's going to set us up for a strategy called link up and look left that I'll teach you later on. You have to be able to really connect with them. And what I mean by that, just to front load it a little bit with you, is connecting your right brain with their right brain. Connecting their right brain with your right brain with their right brain. And so being intentionally present and emotionally connected. And here's the other thing. This really distinguishes the difference between a trauma-informed teacher and a trauma-skilled teacher, is they can distinguish the difference between being willful behavior and survival behavior. Because sometimes it's willful, and with, by the way, strong-willed kids like Maddie and maladaptive kids like my daughter Kennedy, it's willful behavior. But today we're going to talk about kids who come from trauma, which a lot of their behavior comes from survival. Right? Okay, I want to stop there. Any questions so far? Any questions from the group that's joining us remotely? Not yet. All right, here's what I want to do. I want to take just a 4-minute stretch break. We've been at it for about a half hour or so. I just want you to get up and stretch. and just take a quick little brain break, and then we're going to dive into what is it being a trauma-skilled teacher.
I'm gonna check with Kyle, see if he can get that video somehow.
Okay.
through the file that you sent.
Okay. to the PowerPoint presentation. I can send those to you if you want, but I'm going to read a little bit in terms of their social developmental history and some important things about them to give you an idea of their profile in terms of trauma. Zelina is what a lot of teachers call a lost, lazy, and leaky student. Lost, lazy, and leaky. Might sound like a kid who has ADHD. And that's interesting because students who have ADHD or a nonverbal learning disability will also profile like a student who comes from trauma. So for example, if a pediatrician or a neuropsych tries to deal with the impulsivity and the regulation by giving a stimulant medication like Adderall or Ritalin, it's not going to work for a kid who comes from trauma because there's two different things going on. And remember, that's why I started with Maddie, who's a strong-willed student. And then Kennedy, who's maladaptive, doesn't come from trauma. Now we've got kids who come from trauma, but they profile very similar. So you might have some kids who are on medication, at least stimulant medication, who come from trauma, and it's not working, right? And that's an important thing. And so that's Zelina. Zelina, teachers call her the lost, lazy, and leaky student, and therefore I call her lost, difficult planning, organization, starting a task. She has a very difficult time getting started on classroom assignments, projects, tests, things like that. And also sustaining that. She gets off task, so that's why they call her lost. Like, Zelina, up here, honey, up here. Right? She's always seems to be lost kind of in her own world, like a kid who has ADHD. They call her lazy, meaning that she's unmotivated, apathetic, performance and production starts to tank. That's very interesting because about when students who come about second grade, and maybe the elementary staff that are joining us remotely, you see this with kids starting to hit about the second grade, that their motivation starts to tank. And that's when you know they have these scripts running in their head. And I don't know if you've heard this script before, but the script moves from, I'm sorry I made a mistake, to, I'm sorry I am a mistake. See the difference? That's the script. That's why culture and climate in your classroom are incredibly important. They'll eat compliance for lunch every day of the week. And the leaky student, meaning we have regulation issues, which, guess what, points to brain integration. So we have regulation issues. The leaky student, meaning she has leaky brakes, she doesn't know when to stop. So inhibitory control becomes an issue. And here is just a short little video of Zelina, by the way, who is not diagnosed with anything. There's no D. There's no ADHD, ODD, OCD, DMDD, AUD. There's no D. But she profiles like a student. I want to read this to you real quick. This is the profile of her. Here's what she does in class. Here's the terms of her behavior. Shouts and screams out loud during whole group lessons. Doesn't follow any classroom expectations. Disrespectful to adults, always rude. Has an attitude about everything and always has to say her opinion or comments, often not appropriate. When she doesn't get her way and told to do something from an adult that she doesn't want to do, she starts throwing fits, screaming, crying, stomping. She grabs me at times. This is the teacher. She sits by herself on an island away from others during instruction time. She shouts to other kids across the room, calling them stupid. She explodes very easily. We call them awfulizers and catastrophizers because she explodes very easily. That points to the regulation or the brain integration. Once she explodes, she cannot calm herself down and starts running up to kids, hitting them, and cannot control herself. She refuses to sit in her chair. Sometimes she chooses to lay down on the floor during instruction. And her relationship with kids is not good, always calling them inappropriate names, hitting, kicking, and touching them. She has never been diagnosed with a disorder. She's never been prescribed medications to treat behavior or mental health issues. And here's what you get. Do we have the sound? Shoot, we don't have the sound. So what you have is a student who's screaming uncontrollably. And you're thinking in your mind, this is a meltdown. Yeah, you're right, it is a meltdown. What you're thinking in your mind is, we have to de-escalate this. Yeah, we have to de-escalate it. Better yet, we have to integrate it. Meaning we have to integrate the brain. We have to do a vertical integration, have the bottom of the brain talking with the top of the brain, and right to left integration, which is a horizontal integration. Without that, you don't have a kid who's emotionally regulated. Without that, you don't have a kid who's exercising executive function of the brain, thinking head, in the ready-to-learn brain. And most kids, if not all kids who come from trauma, have what we call a disintegrated brain. Maybe we can get the audio with that a little bit later. This is Joshua. Joshua is a hot mess. So I want you to listen to this profile and just think about Joshua being in your classroom. Joshua is considered the mean, manipulative, and malicious student. He lacks empathy and sympathy. Joshua is a kid who will put a cat in a microwave for 2 minutes to see what happens. And you've heard about that, kids without a conscience. Josh is manipulative. He is definitely a kid who uses tactics and traps. Remember, tactics are used to confuse you, wear you out, and exhaust you. And that's why you have to be prepared as a trauma-skilled teacher. Be ready for the tactics and the traps. And by the way, the number one mistake that we all make as teachers is we fall into the traps. And I went over those last year, and I'm trying to blend those in now. The questioning trap, the preaching trap. You hopefully remember some of those. So he uses tactics and traps, and he's malicious. He causes harm by destroying people or property. So he can be aggressive, and he can be volatile. Here's his social developmental history, just little snippets. Think about this. Dad was in prison when Joshua turned 5 years old. His mother was shot in gang violence in an episode shortly after. So just when he turned 5, his dad went to prison, mom was shot. He was abandoned by his mother and moved in with grandparents at age 7. He had chronic ear infections between 1 and 3 years of age. That's why reading is terrible for him. He had tubes placed in his ears at age 3. Listen to this. Diagnosed with DD at age 3, diagnosed with ODD at age 6, diagnosed with ADHD at age 7, diagnosed with PTSD at age 8, diagnosed with DMDD at age 9, and diagnosed with RAD, reactive attachment disorder, at age 10. And here's the deal. It doesn't matter the D. Pick a D. It doesn't matter. Because it's masking what's happening underneath with brain integration. Teachers report that Joshua is profane, hostile, uncooperative, disruptive, defiant, assaultive, and unstable. He's had multiple suspensions for repeatedly fighting, stealing, and defacing, destroying property, supplies, materials, and personal belongings. Refuses to complete assignments, study for tests, or work in groups and projects. Will run out of the classroom or school building on a dime. That's called elopement. So even though he has a bunch of D's at the end of his name, so to speak, the underlying issue is this developmental exposure to trauma. This is Natalie. Natalie is argumentative, aggressive, and assaultive. She uses the jab. She justifies, argues, and blames. That's being a prepared trauma-skilled teacher to understand you will have the jab. They will justify, they will argue, and they will blame. And that's why you choose relationships over being right, because if you don't understand the jab, you'll get into a power struggle. And the most important thing here for kids who come from trauma, when it's survival behavior, not willful behavior, is that the relationships trump being right. So she's argumentative, uses the jab, she's aggressive, she overreacts to minor stressors, which we'll find out a little bit later why. And she's assaultive, she attacks verbally and physically. Natalie, from birth to age 17 months of age, Natalie lived with her biological mother, maternal grandmother, and brother. And although there's little information about her biological parents, there is a strong suspicion that her mother smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and used illicit drugs during pregnancy. She lived in a number of different homes from birth to 2.5 years of age, which should be a little tickler in your brain going pre-exposure to trauma. At that time, developmental screeners revealed she was on target developmentally, DCFS was granted temporary custody and placed Natalie in foster care due to substantial risk of harm, of physical injury, environmental injuries to health and welfare by neglect and inadequate supervision. That should be a tickler in your head. Saying, doesn't matter the D, but what we have here is survival behavior. These are all indicators signaling to you about a kid that on the surface level looks like and profiles like a kid who's maladaptive, meaning they have maladaptive thinking patterns that we talked about last time in terms of behavior. These kids, underlying its survival behavior, not necessarily willful. Her foster mother reported Natalie always demonstrated a high activity level and had difficult learning to sit still for TV or to listen to stories compared to other children. She was adopted at age 6. Her medical history reported remarkable for concussion. I wonder why. I'll tell you why, because she got the crap beat out of her. That's why. She has a history of sleep disorder. She has a history of frequent urination. She has been prescribed Metadate and Strattera to treat significant attentional and behavioral dysregulation. However, they were discontinued because they were not effective. Ding, 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 ding. She continues to wake up frequently during the night. She overeats to a point of vomiting, which should point you to this. Many kids who come from trauma like her, not all, and I don't want to canvass this for all of them, but many of them become hoarders. You can take anything away from a kid. At the elementary level, we can take recess away. At the high school level, we can take the dance away, eating with your friends away, your cell phone away. But here's what you can never take away from a kid is their right to survive. You can't take that away. And so kids like Natalie, that everything's been taken away, right? Sometimes what they do is externally they'll profile as a hoarder. She overeats to a point of vomiting. She becomes easily angered and emits significant aggression toward others. She appears anxious and fearful and tense most of the time. She has been caught stealing at school or coercing other students to give her food or other belongings. Teachers report that Natalie is profane, hostile, and cooperative. She's disruptive. Currently, she's eligible for special ed services, and she's receiving a resource study hall and general accommodations like extra time, quiet setting for tests and adapted materials. But she's currently failing math and science. Here's the important thing. Teachers and administrators, this is in her developmental history, by the way. Teachers and administrators are responding to Natalie in the usual and typical ways by cajoling her, bargaining with her, isolating her, and suspending her. Teachers and administrators were focused on adjudicating her behavior instead of healing it. And Natalie experienced a patchwork of classroom management practices from different teachers. Nothing was working. In fact, what happened was this. Mr. Uphoff, I don't know what to say or how to say what I have to say, but I can't take this anymore. I don't want to look like a kid who can't do anything in my life because I can. You see, I'm getting really stressed out right now, so I'm going to get my GED. Please don't look down on me because I really don't know what to say to you, okay? I guess I'm asking you not to call me a failure. There's the script. Please, I'm really sorry. Well, I don't have much to say, so I'm going to go. Baloney, she had a lot to say. Didn't she? Here's the message. The message is that a student like Natalie who comes from developmental trauma, they missed it. We missed it. We try to adjudicate the behavior instead of healing the behavior. We use typical practices that were exclusionary instead of practices that help with integration. And we get this. And I'm not saying that if we had done that, we wouldn't have ultimately got this, but maybe it would have mitigated this a little bit, or maybe a lot. So we have different students, different grade levels, different developmental levels, but yet they're similar, and what they're similar in is what I call a hijacked brain. You have one student who's not diagnosed with anything. You have a student who has almost every D you could have after your name. And you have a high school student who has now these value scripts running in her head that she's the mistake, not that she made a mistake. But what they have in common is this hijacked brain. And what I mean by that, on the surface, you see these things, which are called surface level behaviors. The meltdowns, the arguing, the defiance, the aggression. And we spend most of our time focusing on these and very little of our time focusing on the root. And what I mean by the root is brain integration, the emotions, the thinking patterns, the environmental influences, their dispositions, and the physiological response. And if we could spend more time here and less time here, then maybe we could mitigate some of these. In fact, we can. These then fit into this formula. There's no formula for compliance, but there is a formula for behavior. And here's the formula. B equals FPE. Once you learn and understand this formula for behavior, you will become more of a trauma-skilled teacher than just a trauma-informed teacher. And you have to understand this formula, and then when you understand it, you actually read it backwards. And here's the formula. B equals any behavior. You know, the defiance, the meltdowns, the aggression, the calling you a crackhead witch, flipping you off, running out of the classroom. All of those behaviors are driven by the F, which is the function. And there are 5. And the 5 functions are these. The first one is power and control. Most kids who come from trauma operate off of power and control. Remember, you can take anything away from a kid except their right to survive. So power and control, they operate off of power and control. Another function is tangible reinforcement. Just like Natalie's a hoarder. Something tangible, something she can touch, eat, smell, those types of things. Drives behavior. Social attention will drive behavior. Escape and avoidance will drive behavior. And also sensory stimulation will drive behavior. These functions drive the manifested behavior. But these functions are driven by 2 things. One is the P, which is the person, and the second thing is the E, which is the environmental influences. And here's where it gets somewhat complicated, and I want to share this with you to nudge you into being a trauma-skilled teacher. If I break these out into different buckets, and I understand this one and this one, I understand this. If I understand the P and the E, I understand this. If you want to ultimately change behavior of a strong-willed, maladaptive, or a student who comes from trauma, you have to change the E and you have to change the P. You have to change something in the E and you have to change something in the P. And what I mean by that is this. Maladaptive students like my daughter, Al-Qaeda Kennedy, are driven by maladaptive thinking patterns, specialness, entitlement. And you remember some of those. They're maladaptive thinking patterns that drive maladaptive behavior. Students who come from trauma oftentimes operate on brain integration issues or a disintegrated brain. And so that, as part of their person, is driving the function which drives behavior. So if I can change thinking patterns, I change function, I ultimately change behavior. If I change brain disintegration into brain integration, I change function, I change behavior. But in order to change this, something here has to change. And we all know this. I can't change the home. I can't change the home. I can try to, I can nudge, I can inform, I can train parents, I can try to get them involved and included, but I can't change the home. So that leaves me with this. I can change school and classrooms. I can change what I have control of. Change meaning I can change the way I approach a student. I can change my strategies. I can change my understanding. To ultimately change the way they think or the way they integrate, to ultimately change function, to ultimately change behavior. Does that make sense? That's the formula. And when you start looking through the lens of this changing of something in the classroom environment or school environment to change the way they think or to change brain integration, to change function, change behavior, you start looking at it at a totally different way. In other words, for a student like Natalie at the secondary level, we stop adjudicating the behavior and we start with healing. Because if you don't get to healing and you just adjudicate the behavior, you'll never change the behavior. That make sense? Okay. This hijacking of the brain is called an amygdala hijacking. And this is where it ties in with what Dr. Lori talked about with you. Sensory information is sent to the hypothalamus. That's the brain's relay station. This is what all three of these kids, one that's not diagnosed with anything, one that's diagnosed with everything, and one that dropped out of school and has disintegration. This is what's happening underneath the iceberg. The hypothalamus, which is the brain relay station, when it receives sensory information, it sends information to both the neocortex and the amygdala. The neocortex is the prefrontal cortex of our brain, right? It's where all of our executive functions occur. It's right here in the bald spot in my brain. This is where I plan ahead, I think before I act, I have impulse control, I have inhibitory control. That all happens here. But then there's this emotional part of the brain called the amygdala. That's right here. That's right above my ear. It looks like an acorn, about the size of an acorn. The amygdala is the watchdog of the brain. The amygdala, oftentimes with kids who come from trauma, barks a lot. And our goal as a trauma-skilled teacher is to stop the dog from barking. That's when you know you've gone from trauma-informed to trauma-skilled. Trauma and stress equal an amygdala hijacking. Sensory information is sent to the hypothalamus, the brain relay station, but the amygdala overrides the prefrontal cortex, and the emotional part of the brain takes over. That happened at 6 o'clock in the morning in January when I received a call that my mom was sent to the hospital because she had a tumor on her brain. That happened on March 30th at 5:50 in the morning when I got a call that my dad was laying on the floor dead. That's called acute. And our brains are designed by our Creator to act like that, to function like that. The difference between acute and developmental, you'll have acute trauma, you probably already have. There's traumatic events that happen in your life and your brain takes over and goes into survival mode. But developmental trauma is different because this is running 24/7. It's constantly, the prefrontal cortex is being overridden by the amygdala. So the student ends up operating in the downstairs right of their brain, which points to they're disintegrated because they're not operating both in the downstairs and the upstairs and the right and the left. They're operating down here. Yeah.
So, what do we do with students who come from a significant trauma, who have a big struggle with retaining information at a regular classroom pace?
Well, you have to differentiate a lot. You have to differentiate on steroids. And the problem that we'll get into that they're recognizing right now is a problem with executive functioning. And that includes things like working memory. So there's a lot of strategies that we can unpack in terms of engaging the brain, not enraging the brain. And that leads to things like working memory, flexible thinking, emotional regulation. And that's a perfect question because that points to brain integration, for sure. And we'll get to that. I'll show you some strategies. They're jumping ahead, but I'll get to that. Yeah.
So how do we best identify willful versus survival without the benefit of like those developmental histories?
That's the thing. It's hard, right? What was coming in my mind when you were asking the question is I was going to tell you, look at the social developmental history, right? Which you don't have. So I think that here's one thing you could try to pick up on. Willful behavior is strategic in nature. Survival behavior is not necessarily strategic in nature. It just happens. So, for example, a student who flips their lid all the time, has multiple meltdowns, multiple throughout the day, not just one time a month, but you have kids who have multiple meltdowns, probably I'm looking at a kid that is in survival, not necessarily willful. And that's a hard thing to distinguish. And by the way, that's a great question because that's why we use all three of those buckets. We do use behavior strategies. We're a behavior farmer. We do use brain integration strategies, and we do use SEL strategies, that chicken psychology, for sure. That's why we have to tap into all three, right? Sometimes we don't have the benefit of distinguishing between willful and survival. The best thing is if you have a social developmental history like these three kids, we got the benefit of leaning toward it's probably survival. But if we don't have that, I'd probably look at, is their behavior strategic in nature, meaning traps, tactics, things like that, as opposed to they just react in a certain way that is not strategic in nature. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, so then as a follow-up to that, in a building where kids have 7 or 8 different adults they're interacting with in a day as opposed to one teacher, do you recommend a really streamlined process of communicating?
Absolutely.
To identify these patterns?
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So that looks like a team.
Can you make sure you repeat her question?
I can't, yeah. Her question was, and make sure I get this right. Her question is, when a student like at the elementary, middle, and high school, because at the elementary level they have a classroom teacher, but they'll also have specialist teachers that they go to. They'll also have parapros that they work with. They also have people in the cafeteria and bus drivers, and right? So they run into a lot of different adults. Her question is probably like at the middle school and high school level when kids have 6 or 7 teachers throughout the day, right? Or they see 6 or 7 adults throughout the week, those primary adults. Do you recommend those adults being consistent in their approach, and do they work together on a team? Do they talk about the student? Yes, yes, and yes. What you don't want to have is a patchwork of different approaches. Here's what will happen. If you're not working as a team and being consistent in your approach, and you have a kids exposed to a patchwork of different approaches, here's what will happen. You'll be off balance. Some teachers will be what I call hard, punitive in nature. Some teachers will be weak and permissive in nature. And those are both damaging. Because remember, it's a balance of what? Nurture and structure. And the balance of the structure definitely has to come into play. The balance. You can't be too hard, hostile and punitive. You know, hostile and punitive teachers, you can tell because they start blaming everybody else. They'll blame the parents, they'll blame the bus drivers, they'll blame the administration, they'll blame the teachers below them. What are those 5th grade teachers doing before these kids get up here? They need to teach, right? They start blaming everything. But what they don't do is look at themselves as a piece to the puzzle. They oftentimes, hard, hostile, punitive teachers oftentimes use the same or very similar punishments or consequences. Weak and permissive teachers, they let behavior go unchecked until they can't take it anymore, and then they explode. And weak and permissive teachers they do a great job of connecting with students, I mean, they love on students, they invest in students, but they're too weak and permissive. They don't have the structure. They let things slide too much. For example, when you're dealing with a kid who comes from trauma and you recognize that this is willful behavior, strategic, and not necessarily survival, because that happens, it's not all survival. What happens is that you might let it go unchecked. And by the way, if you let it go unchecked, you just reinforced it to happen again. Right? So the best approach is work as a team, be as balanced as possible, communicate a lot. And part of taking care of yourself, because you don't want to have secondary trauma hit you, is to make sure you partner up, which is you work in a team. Does that help? All right, good questions. So here's what happens over time when cortisol continues to hit the prefrontal cortex of the brain, because cortisol is the hormone that's released when the amygdala suspects that there's some type of danger, threat, or trauma. This is a neurotypically developing brain of an 18-year-old female. This is an 18-year-old female that is about a 10 on the ACE scale, that Adverse Childhood Experience scale, right? So you can actually see the brain develops differently. If we do a PET scan over on the left, that's that healthy brain, and that prefrontal cortex with all the areas in the red firing up, that's executive functioning skills. That's the ready-to-learn brain. That's where we want our kids when they come into class. We want them in the ready-to-learn brain. We want them alert and receptive. But this is like Natalie. So the brain on the right, there's not a lot of executive functioning skills firing up. Her inhibitory control is shot. Her working memory is shot. Not shot, but it's weak. Right? Her emotional control is weak. And that all comes from the upstairs brain, pointing to she has this disintegrated brain where she's living in the bottom right. We can also look at the neural networks. This is a normal neural network. This is a stress neural network. And no wonder then, when we look at executive functioning, meaning working memory, attention and focus, inhibition, planning ahead, emotional control, and problem solving, kids that come from trauma are about 40% delayed. That's why when I talk to teachers and working with kids and coach them on kids, you'll hear teachers for a kid like Natalie say, she's 17 years old, chronological age, she has a developmental age of 10, but she has a street smart age of 25. And that's it. That's why. Because she's always in survival mode, and she's learned how to navigate. Right? All right. So here's what I want you to do, just to get your brains going. To understand how this impacts us, I want you to take 5 minutes, and if you want to work with a partner, I'd prefer that, and I think you would prefer that too. I want you to solve the cookie problem. So hopefully they can see this at the remote site, but don't worry about the breakout rooms. Get together with a partner, and I'm going to start the clock, and you got 5 minutes. I want to see if somebody can solve the cookie problem. Ready? Go. Good luck, by the way. No talking! Did I tell you could talk? I'm just kidding, you can talk. Hey, I saw you at the volleyball game the other night. Awesome, nice job. How'd you feel? It was pretty good? I think it was pretty good. That's awesome. Clarice, don't forget to meet at the 4-H meeting after school. I think you have 4-H today, don't you? You had it yesterday. Oh, okay. All right. You guys have about 3 minutes left. Shh. This is the second time I have asked you or told you. Thank you. Grow up, people. Pardon the interruption. I want to remind staff there's a staff meeting in room 1A after school today, room 1A. Bus 5, 6, and 7 will be in lane 1 and 2. Okay, let's stop. Yay! How many of you like tapped out, were like, I'm done? Okay. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to just get your brains to experience a little bit about the stress and the pressure that it pulls on your executive functioning, right? Okay, so tell me, what did you experience there? Like, be honest, what did you know we were role-playing, you know we were kind of fooling around, but what did you really experience? A lot of distraction. So here comes inhibitory control. That's what inhibitory control is. That's why, by the way, kids who have ADHD are put on Ritalin. Because it sparks the production of what? Dopamine. Dopamine helps with inhibitory control. Not going to work with a kid who comes from trauma. Two different issues, right? So you have a kid who profiles like Natalie and like Zelina and like Joshua, who profile like a kid who might have ADHD. Think about it. Zelina's the lost, lazy, and leaky student. And you're thinking, that kid needs to be put on meds. I need to have a Ritalin salt lick right outside the classroom doors. Just lick it when she comes in, right? Inhibitory control. You had to inhibit distracting information to keep your brain what? Focused on what? The task at hand. So great. So a lot of distractions you had to manage through and navigate through. Imagine if last night your fat stepdad slipped into your bed. Unthinkable for us, isn't it? Here's the deal. I'm not even talking about poverty. Poverty's not on the list of the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Poverty's not on there. Just because you come from poverty doesn't mean you come from trauma. Doesn't mean you come from a toxic environment. But just imagine if your fat stepdad did that, right? Or other things. Okay, so inhibitory control. What else did you experience? How about anything from the elementary school? Ask them. I want them to respond. What did they experience through this? Come on, guys. What else? Confusion, annoyance. Yeah. Kind of like watching the debate last night. Pretty annoying.
You might not know if the person wants to work with you.
Yeah. Using all those soft skills, those social emotional skills, right? You got to connect with the people. You don't know if they want to work with you. I mean, all of those come into play. What else? Yeah. So hold on to that. But I want to talk about annoyance. Annoyance also blends into irritability, does it not? Did you get a little irritated? Sure you did. You got irritated. Here's the deal. When you have a kid from trauma comes walking through your door, understand this, they sort of walk in an irritable state. Have you ever had a kid walk through the door and you look at them and you're like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a tough day. You can see it. You can see that irritability. That's another thing you can distinguish between willful and survival, right? Okay, go ahead. As the instructor, because I kept polling you. Right. All right. Did anybody start listing things or drawing out a diagram? Okay. Right. You know why you did that? Because you're smart. No, you know why you did that? Because what I did was I started pulling on your working memory, and your working memory couldn't take it. Your working memory is different than short-term memory, and your short-term memory and working memory is different than your long-term memory. Working memory, by the way, is like, if you peel back the layers of information on this kid's brain like Zelina, you'll realize working memory is very, very weak. So that's why, as a teacher, you chunk things. You take time. You don't say, okay, guys, when you get into class, sit down next to your partner. Let's do problems 1 through 10, and then I want you to, when you're done, I want you to get with another partner, and I want you to see which ones are wrong, and then, right? You can't do a rapid fire. Processing, working memory. And your working memory was so pressed that your brain, which you've been taught, said, let's make this visual. And then you went to drawing it out or writing it down in columns and things like that. That's a great strategy, but you've been taught to do that. A lot of kids haven't been taught to do that. And so their working memory is pressed. Okay, what else? Yeah.
So stress, annoyance, gave up, not able to focus on him because I don't have the answer. Anxiety with the time limits.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed with the distractions. The double standard from the adult speaking and distracting.
That's
So,
right.
Just too much to process. So,
Just too much to process. That's right. Okay, just a little taste for you to go back and remember. It's probably good for all students, but especially students who come from trauma, right? To think about that in terms of, and that gives you a taste, so when we go into strategies in the next part of the session, you'll understand why we're doing the strategies we're doing. Yes, ma'am? There is an answer. I don't have I forget the answer, but you can look it up. How many of you looked it up? You looked it up? Did you Google it? You cheated. You took I guess that was a cheat.
Computer's right in front of me. I just Googled the cookie.
Okay, what is the answer?
It just keeps talking about executive functioning. That's why I can't find the answer.
There is an answer. Okay, somebody has the answer.
Rachel's red, Linda's blue, and Eda's blue and Linda's green.
Are you sure? Did you work that out mentally, or did you okay. I tell you what, after the session or maybe during a break, just Google it. The answer's on there. By the way, this has been in the psych books for years. It's been out there for years. I think since the maybe late 80s or late 90s. So it's been out there. But it gives us a clue on the stress that's put on, at least what I'm talking about in terms of the upstairs part of our brain, which is executive function. Okay? Just for you to get a taste of what it might be like to be a kid from trauma. Okay, so, Rob, I wonder if this is not working here.
What's that?
My clicker. There we go. All right. So here's what I wanted you to experience is your right brain, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. You had to control your emotions of annoyance and irritation. Maybe if you had a bad morning this morning, something happened at home, which none of us know about. You were screaming at your husband or kids as they were walking out. You were walking out the door, something like that. You had to control that emotions, which, by the way, come from the downstairs part of your brain. Those are where the big emotions like fear and anger come from. You had to keep that in check. At the same time, you had to link up with your left brain. You had to engage in things like linguistics and logic and sequence. That comes from the left part of your brain. And this was a problem that was a puzzle mess. And your brain had to start to get it in sequence, and you had to understand language. Then in your bottom part of your brain, which is called the basement of your brain, you had to monitor and control the bigger emotions such as anger. So because you're adults, some of you just said, this is stupid, I'm done with this. You tapped out. I know you did, because I did. But you had to control your emotions. None of you fell on the floor doing the starfish screaming like a first grader would do, or sometimes a high schooler would do. That come from trauma, because you have integration. So you can take the problem, like the cookie problem, and all the pressure and the stress that goes along with it, and because you're an adaptive adult, your bottom part of your brain, the basement of your brain, handled the bigger emotions. Then the top part of your brain, your executive functioning, that's this right here, you had to exercise working memory, inhibitory control. You had to flex your thinking. You had to maintain attention and focus. You had to have grit. You had to get through it. And some of you weaklings didn't. You tapped out. And that's okay. You had organize and you had to regulate and self-control. Right there is brain integration, and I wanted you to experience. So why is this happening? A lot of people ask me when I do trainings, why is this happening? And you have a clue. But here's what I've done for you. I've taken all the research and I put it together in a simple visual for us to understand. And I assembled it so that it represents different parts of our body. First of all, that hijacking of the brain, we have, the mind is experiencing, our kids, I want you to think about our kids, a toxic level of stress every day. Like, it's okay to, our brains are designed to handle stress. Kids from trauma, it's way, way beyond normal. And that's why we call it toxic. That's why we have a spike of mental health issues, a reporting of loneliness, suicides, and you guys know this, the number one suicide population, high school girls. You got to keep your eye out, right? Increased reporting of loneliness, anxiety, and depression. Our mouth, if you watched the debate last night, you saw this, but kids are experiencing this modeling. More is caught than taught. In the behavioral world, more is caught than taught. And our kids have a modeling of anger, hostility, resentfulness, bitterness, and hatred from adults. That is priming their brain. Remember, E, P, the environmental influences impact the thinking, the way I think, my disposition, my attitude, my mood, my emotions, all of that. That's where this comes from. The heart, there's an uptick in emotional distress, torn families, destructive relationships, unstable home environments. Joshua, the kid that was turtling, the middle school kid, and I told you he was a hot mess. I had an opportunity to meet his dad. His dad was out of prison. If you remember, his dad was in prison when he turned 5, and then his mom was shot. And I had an opportunity to meet his dad when Joshua was in middle school, and he had reactive attachment disorder issues. And Dad had developed what he called a progressive relationship. Now, I don't know about here in Indiana, but out west where Joshua comes from, here's what they call a progressive relationship, because it wouldn't fly in, I don't think, maybe it would fly here, maybe not, probably not in Tremont, Illinois. Progressive relationship is when Dad is living with a married couple, and he is dating both the mom and the dad. And so districts pay me a lot of money to look at a parent like that and say, the only thing that's screwing up your kid is you. And so it goes back to this uptick in emotional distress, torn families, destructive relationship, and unstable home environments. Josh's home environment was critically unstable. Financially, we are out of pocket, or we are out of bounds. It's the pocket. We are out of bounds with high consumer debt. Meaning that when you look at kids who come from trauma, and by the way, it is across the board. It doesn't just happen in poor families and medium families. It happens in wealthy families as well. But a lot of times the stress comes from us being financially out of bounds. About 80% of people in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. What that means then, practically, if you get into your car in the morning and it doesn't start, and you have a crisis, and by the way, the COVID has hammered, absolutely hammered this. So be prepared. When your kids come back, they might be different, because a lot of people are experiencing this financial hardship. It puts stress. Stress then activates what? It activates the amygdala, releases cortisol. And then you have that brain, those different neural networks. And it all sort of cascades together. Our students are sleep deprived, time management crisis. They have an incessant bombardment of technology, which, smartphones, online gaming. In fact, to such a point that the WHO, the World Health Organization, 2 years ago, came up with a new diagnosis called gaming disorder. Gaming disorder. It's when people are doing video games so much that it is now a disorder. It's hijacking our brains. The stomach, this blends into it. Have any of you ever had the opportunity to do poop transplants? I know that's kind of gross, but it's a technical thing. Anybody seen that? Because we'll do that in our clinic in terms of if a student is severely depressed or if they have severe behavior, we'll actually do a fecal transplant because there's bacteria, as you know, from fecal matter that sends signals to your brain to release certain chemicals like dopamine and serotonin. And sometimes, just like we do a heart transplant, we have to do a poop transplant in order for that gut to start releasing the appropriate bacteria to signal those appropriate chemicals, like mainly serotonin, which is the joy chemical. I don't recommend anybody trying that at home, but you can do it in a clinical setting like we do. It's quite fascinating, actually. Read up on it. It's quite fascinating, which, by the way, comes into play here with all kids, but especially kids come from trauma. Because of the disintegrated brain, we're after every little thing we can get. And part of that is what they digest, the stomach. And the two killers of serotonin, the joy chemical, are sugar and processed food. I call it the Eatos effect. Don't eat anything that ends with Eatos, Doritos, Fritos, Cheetos, and Ados, like potatoes. It will kill serotonin. You can actually see it eating, your body eating the serotonin. And what do our kids eat? What do kids who come from poverty eat? They eat cheap processed food. And so the economic hardships, uptick in poverty, buying cheaper products. There are more Dollar General and Dollar Tree stores than there are McDonald's now. When was the last time you went to a Dollar Tree or a dollar store or a Dollar General and bought anything fresh? You haven't. All of these things in the research point to we have kids coming through our doors that have disintegrated brains, non-integrated brains. And here you as a teacher, middle school, high school teacher, elementary teacher, want that kid in the upstairs part of their brain, the ready to learn part of the brain, alert and receptive. You have this going on. And the feet represent an uptick in the diagnosis of chronic metabolic diseases such as diabetes and hypertension because of the stress. We're going to talk about this and we're going to take another break. But what ends up happening is, and I've signaled this a couple of times by saying it, is a disintegrated brain. And what I mean by that, and what Dan Siegel means by that in his book called The Whole Brain Child, and some of you might have read that, and if you haven't read that, go read that. It's a fascinating book. And this comes out of his book, and I want to give him credit for it, is that we want our students, in terms of emotion, to be flowing down sort of a peaceful river. Sort of at peace with themselves, at peace with the people around them. But kids who come from trauma will bank off sharply to the bank of chaos or bank of rigidity. So here's something to think about. They're so used to chaos that when they come into your classroom and you have structure and routine and procedures and sameness and attachment, they don't like that because they're not comfortable with it. They become comfortable with chaos, and they bank over to that side of the bank of chaos, and they create it because they're comfortable with it. Isn't that fascinating? They also could bank over to the bank of rigidity, and that's about power and control, which leads into executive function, because part of executive function is flexible thinking. They can't flex their thinking. They start to hoard because they want control. They start to argue with you more because they want control. And this is the bank of rigidity. And so that's why we have to not only focus on these compliance strategies that I went over last year when we were together, but today we're talking about this brain integration. And when we get back from a 5-minute break, I want to dive deep into what are the strategies to help promote brain integration now that you know what it is. All right, so let's do a 5-minute break. Is that all right? Or let's do a 7-minute break.
Henry Grady himself said we have to find something more than cotton to make money. So how would he support farmers? I'm just asking you guys, how do you think he would help poor farmers diversify? They were known to grow cotton. What else he say do? Say something. Grow their stuff. Like, what's every kid's favorite vegetable? Corn. Corn. Every little kid loves corn. My nephews don't like any other vegetable except corn. And give me some.
Hear me? There we go. Let's come back together. So we're talking about brain integration. I know on one slide I misspelled that. I think it said Brian integration, but I was typing too fast. So I apologize for that. Okay, so in simpleton terms, not to dummy this down, but just to make it practical and simple, what we're talking about in terms of brain integration is the downstairs and the upstairs, the right and the left brain, working independently, doing their own functions, but also working as a whole, right? Working as a team, working as a group. That's brain integration. And what you'll notice is that if you ever have taught kids that come from trauma and or that are maladaptive kids have some integration issues as well. You'll really see this, now that you're aware of it, you really see it come out. You're like, oh my word, that's what he's talking about. Because think about it this way. If a student in your class can't pay attention, is always distracted, can't maintain focus, being attuned, can't really tap into working memory, can't regulate themselves, is always operating out of anxiety or fear, those big emotions in the basement of their brain, how are they ever going to access and master what you're teaching them? They're not. That's why teachers like Mr. Brown at Duren Middle School in Savannah made the ABCs really big in his class. Meaning it was priority, because he understood that if they can't regulate themselves, pay attention, all of that, be in the upstairs part of their brain, and get this integration, they're never going to really get and master what he was teaching them. So this is why it's important. I might have to switch this pointer here because something's going on. So the goal of this is we want an alert and receptive brain, and it's sort of like this illustration of sort of building this house. And so integration is building the staircase between the basement and the upstairs and the right and the left. Here's the thing to remember. Kids that come from trauma oftentimes are dominant in the bottom right part of the brain. That's where they live. That's where they operate. And by the way, it's fully furnished. The basement of their brain's like the man cave. They love it there. You know who else loves it there? Babies. Because when a baby's born, guess where they're born? In the basement of their brain. In other words, like the left part of their brain's not fully developed yet, right? They don't understand language and logic and sequence. That comes a lot later. They're also born in the basement right. The right part of the brain is all about what? Visuals. They're picking up on eye contact and your facial expressions, and they're hearing your tone and all of that. So a simple way to think about this is just as a baby is born and living in the basement right of their brain, so is a student like Zelina and Josh and Natalie who come from trauma. It's a good way to think about it. And we have to integrate, we have to build this staircase to the upstairs, the receptive and alert brain, the upstairs brain, and also the right to the left. So I just want to make sure I cover this so that we all understand what this is. Brain integration is both horizontal and vertical. Horizontal, when I talk about horizontal integration, that means the right brain emotion is working well with the left brain logic. This thing in the middle, the corpus callosum right here, which I'll show you a picture of, that big, thick fibrous bundle of fibers, you remember that in your classes? That's what communicates the right and the left brain. That's the channels. And what happens is kids that come from trauma divorce the left side of the brain from the right. They shut it off. There's no logic about this. There's no sequence about this. There's nothing. They just shut it off. The corpus callosum then doesn't fire up. And so integration, promoting integration, is we got to open the channels of communication. We're in the right brain working with the left brain. And then the upstairs executive functioning working well with the downstairs survival. Remember, kids like Zelina live right here. They don't live up here. In fact, they don't exercise that very often, so it doesn't get practice. So when they're presented with the cookie problem, they tap out. Too much. And that's why I wanted to give you a taste of the cookie problem. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. Students exposed to trauma, developmental trauma, are masters at reading tone, facial expressions, posture, and gestures. They may not have the skill themselves. In fact, a lot of them don't. It's called the soft skills, the social skills. You know what I'm talking about, right? But they have their doctorate degree in reading all of these nonverbal and paraverbal signals you send, even with your mask on. They can read it. They become masters. That's why Zelina is a 17-year-old with a 10-year-old developmental level, but a 25-year-old in terms of street smart. So they're living in the right part of the brain, which is voice, tone, eye contact, facial expressions, posture, and gestures. They're reading you, and just remember, they're masters at it. They're much better than you are. But they have divorced themselves from the left side of the brain, which is linear, logic, literal, linguistics. In fact, all of these that start with L and in a list, left part of my brain loves that. The right part of the brain helps us understand the meaning and feel of an experience. It's the holistic. It's sort of like the spirit of the law rather than the left brain, which is the letter of the law. You probably heard those phrases before. The right brain picks up on the spirit of the law. The left brain understands the letter, the details of the law. It's holistic. It picks up on facial expressions, eye contact, all of that. Logic, responsibility, and time do not exist in the right part of the brain. And that's why a lot of times we'll talk about them living in the moment, being impulsive, because they're dominantly in the right part of the brain. The left part of the brain, again, logic, literal, linguistic, linear, loves lists, all of that. But kids that come from trauma sort of divorce themselves from that. It's separated. In fact, I always say this, the right part of the brain is an emotional flood. The left part of the brain is a desert with them. And our job is to integrate right to left. So the downstairs part of the brain, students exposed to trauma are primed to operate in the downstairs part of the brain, which is survival mode. You know that. You understand that. But that's where the big emotions of danger and fear and the stress response system of fight, flight, and freeze, that's where they operate. Here's the deal. The deal is, you see this right here? That, I would say, is the amygdala, and that's the baby gate to that steps going upstairs. And the amygdala puts the baby gate up and says, you can't go upstairs. And our job sort of is to open up that baby gate to allow that student to walk upstairs and to access all of these executive functioning skills. Downstairs is the limbic region, primitive functions, impulsivity, strong emotions. I call this, they live in the 2 a.m. brain and the bleacher brain. Just so you remember this, because it's how I remember it. The 2 a.m. brain that they live in is, imagine that you're walking home from an event, a party, let's say at 2 a.m. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're walking by yourself, and you're walking on the sidewalk, and all of a sudden you hear some rustling going on in the shrubs. What happens to your body? Your amygdala fires up, right? Cortisol is released, adrenaline is released, you go into survival mode. That's the part of your body that allows you to act before you think. The deal with Zelina and Josh and Natalie is they're in the 2 a.m. brain all the time. I also call it the bleacher brain because if you've ever been at a little league baseball game sitting in the bleachers and one of those kids hits a foul ball and your body goes like that, you don't have control over it, it just happens. That's the difference between survival and willful. Willful is strategic, planned. Survival is not necessarily that. And by the way, the brain then, as you can imagine, you saw the structure of the brain change with these kids. It's primed, we call it priming, it's primed to operate in the basement right. So that's why they live in this 2 a.m. brain and the bleacher brain. The amygdala is the big dog here. And I would say this, if you remember anything from today, and I know I'm going over a lot, but Rob, if you walk out of here with one thing, here's what I want you to walk out of here with. Your job as a trauma-skilled, not just trauma-informed, trauma-skilled teacher is to stop the dog from barking. Because if that dog barks, then that kid's not integrated. And the amygdala is the watchdog of the brain. It hijacks the upstairs, which the upstairs of the brain is where we want them to be. And Rob has this slide deck, and he can distribute this and share it with you so you can go back and look at it as a resource. But this is where we want them to be, regulating their emotions, considering their consequences, thinking before they act, consider how others feel. That's called empathy, and also sympathy. But they're not there because they live in the downstairs part of the brain. And I know I keep hammering on that, but the job is to stop the dog from barking, in simple terms. The upstairs part of the brain helps us to monitor the downstairs part of the brain. So when those big emotions like fear and being angry, like when you were doing the cookie problem and you were annoyed, if you had an underlying under that iceberg, that big fear coming up, or that big anger coming up, that little cookie problem would have taken, that anger would have taken that over. And the upstairs part of your brain is like, I'm annoyed, I hate this guy, I want to get out of this session, but I'm just gonna get through it. That's what self-control is. All right, I want to get into strategies. So there's two buckets of strategies that I want to present to you today. I want to check the time. Okay, there's two buckets of strategies. The first bucket that I want to get into is called the responsive strategies, and the second is proactive. You know why I didn't start with proactive? Do you know why I started with responsive? Because every teacher in the nation that I talk to wants to know, what do I do when this kid calls me a crackhead witch? What do I do when this kid is 10 minutes late and I say, Samantha, have a seat, and she flips me off? What do I do? You talk about keeping the dog from barking. How do I keep the dog from barking? And those are called responsive strategies, and they're also called proactive to help keep the dog from barking. So we're going to talk about responsive strategies first. And one of the most impactful strategies is called the behavioral response framework. But then I want to introduce you to zone meetings, and now that we have the video up and running, that'd be great. Commitment conference, collaborative problem-solving meetings, and then we're going to get into restorative practices like victim-offender mediation meetings. Why? Because this kid has divorced themselves from the left part of the brain and the upstairs part of the brain. Go ahead and adjudicate the behavior. You'll never be able to integrate, and therefore never be able to sort of heal and change the behavior. That's why we have to change to things like this. So the behavioral response framework. So this is what happens. This is what you do as a teacher or a support person when the student behaves in a certain way. And it could be either willful or it could be survival, but this is a response. Notice I didn't say a reaction. This is how you respond to the behavior and not react to the behavior. And by the way, it goes back to last year when I exposed you to choice language. And you probably saw a little bit of that in this framework. So here is how this flows. Here's the behavioral response framework. The first thing is set, train, reinforce, and model. Do you remember that from last year? Where you set very, very clear expectations. And I mean crystal clear. Don't leave any room for them to jab, justify, argue, blame. Don't leave any room for tactics and traps. When you have classroom expectations or online expectations, make sure they are crystal clear because they will find the crack. If you say the expectation in our shop class, our woods class, our art class, our whatever class is to be responsible and respectful, that's unclear. And you're going to set yourself up for the jab. Remember, conflict is inevitable, combat's optional. Set yourself up so you can mitigate that. So set expectations very clear. Take some time to front load them. Train them to mastery. Don't open a book, and I know you were already into it, but the preference here is not to open up a book until you know they've mastered your expectations. Take time because you're going to gain time back throughout the year. Then reinforce. Notice I didn't say reward. Reinforce at a high frequency. This taps into the behavior bucket that I talked about as part of the the 3 buckets in that triangle. Reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. Use whatever, but reinforce them meeting the expectations, and then model. What happens is, in your culture, in your climate, in your classroom, more is caught than taught. So model, model, model. If you want them to use responsible language, you have to use responsible, dignified language. If you want them to be on time, you have to be on time. If you want them to be prepared, you have to be prepared. So model, model, model. More is caught than taught. All right. Then be ready for a student response. And here's how I look at this in terms of behavior. You can look at it any way you want. I don't care. I've done this for 30 years, and I know how I look at it with behavior. They're either going to meet your expectations or not. It's as simple as that. They're either going to meet them or they're not. Be ready for your response when they meet them and they don't meet them. When they meet them, be ready to reinforce. Always reinforce. And I just put a few up there, but this should be 20 deep for you. If you don't have an idea how to reinforce them, ask them. Get the student input. Ask them, what do they like? What fires them up? What motivates them? What are they interested in? Right? But be ready to reinforce. Then be ready when they choose not to, because they will. They will choose not to meet. Be careful right here you don't get into traps and you don't fall prey to tactics. Because when they don't meet expectations, that's when tactics and traps occur. So be ready. I call it when behavior gets shaky, you get shifty. You have to shift. There are 4 levels of shifting. Are you ready? Here they are. When a student does not meet your expectation, the first level is called a redirect or redo. It's the humor play response. Here's why. You want to sneak in the humor. You know why? Because humor disarms the watchdog. A lot of times, humor will disarm the amygdala. And remember, you want to keep the dog from barking. So sneak in a little bit of humor. This is why being a balanced teacher, not being too hard, punitive, and hostile, really comes into play for you. Hostile, punitive teachers will look at some, Rob, get your mask on now. Now! Okay, so that's going to enrage the brain, right? The watchdog, not engage the brain. So how could you, if Rob doesn't have his mask on, let's just take an example. If Rob doesn't have his mask on, he's supposed to have his mask on, how do you as a teacher understand the first level of the shifty response, humor and play, for a redo and a redirect? What would that look like? What do you guys think? You've probably done it before. I'm sure you have. Yeah, I'm sure you have. You're not yet. You probably, some of this comes natural to some of you guys.
I tell them I like their mask.
Yeah, something like, I like your mask, or is that humorous?
Yeah, because they're not wearing one.
Now, here's the deal. Don't be sarcastic. Make sure when you sneak in the humor that it's harmless humor, not harmful humor. I don't know if I told you this story last year of Samantha, a high school student who was chronically late to math class and always throwing out tactics, and the teacher would react to her and not respond to her. Did I tell you this story? She walked in, okay, she walked in 10 minutes late, and I was observing, and she walked in, she said, hey, here she's walking into class, she said, split second of whether you're going to engage the brain or enrage the brain. One or the other. Right? The teacher came over to Samantha, got in her face, and she said, Samantha, page 24, problems 1 through 10. Samantha gave her blowback. And here's what she said, you're such a freaking witch. She didn't use freaking. You're such a freaking witch. And the teacher could have snuck in some humor. The teacher could have said, you think I'm a witch? Wait till you see me ride my broomstick in tomorrow. It disarms the watchdog. Something like that, but you got to be prepared. You got to be on top of it. You have to understand the kid comes from trauma and what happens to the brain. This is where becoming a trauma skill. She could have said that. You know what she said? You think I'm a witch? Have you met your grandmother? What do you think Samantha did? Boom. She's out. By the way, we always talk about relationships, don't we? Rob, I know you are talking about, got to have relationships with kids. That's the foundation. And I'm going to spin off of that and say, it's what kind of relationship? With kids that come from trauma, one of the goals is to draw them closer to you so that you promote more cooperation. When you say, have you met your grandmother? That creates distance and then creates resistance. It's messy. So we're going to sneak in the player humor, maybe do a redirect. Oh, Rob, hold on a minute. Where are my glasses? I am getting old. Do you have your mask on? Oh, now you do. Okay. Right, I kind of snuck in the humor, and you get that, right? I might redirect, Rob. I might ask for a redo. Oh, wait, why don't you come in and try that again, right? That's when the kid's regulated. The amygdala hasn't hijacked the brain yet. But when you sense that the amygdala is hijacking the brain, you go into a regulation response. And that's when I might do a reset or a refocus. A lot of teachers set up a reset area in their room, a brain break area in the room. It's called a reset area with think plans. You might ask the student, hey, Rob, can you run this down to Mrs. Johnson's real quick? Just get him up and moving. You know why getting him up from his desk or his chair and moving and get him out of that room in different context? Because it produces lots of different chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, all those good things we want, which, by the way, helps us to disarm the watchdog. But if Rob sort of digs his heels in, which, by the way, when they come from survival, that's what they'll do. Then you go into limit setting. And remember, by the way, when you're limit setting, maybe this is what the deal is. I'm going to show you this. You probably remember this. When you're limit setting, remember this. Sound like Siri, look like Queen Elizabeth. Do you remember that? That's when you limit set. So as part of my flexible response, I'm going to set limits, and be an effective limit setter is sounding like Siri and looking like Queen Elizabeth. All right, I just had to go there since I was at that spot. And then if Rob escalates, then I have to go in my crisis response. And those of you who've been trained, you follow the crisis response policy of your district. But here's the important part. When that event is over, the job and role of a trauma-skilled teacher is to reconnect with that student and work on restoring and repairing. That's when you have victim offender mediation meetings. That's when you might have commitment review conferences. So you might use action-oriented consequences when you are setting limits. That's a responsive approach. The deal with action-oriented consequences is that it's a great opportunity for them to learn a new way to think or a new skill. If you don't use action-oriented consequences, you're just adjudicating the behavior. What's an action-oriented consequence? They have to take action. And what's a true action-oriented consequence? It's when you delay access to a privilege until they show you the behavior you want them to emit. Very simple, like at the elementary level. Very simple example is, if Rob was blurting out all day long, instead of saying, Rob, you're on the red bench for lunch recess. I have had it. No recess for you. You think that's a punishment or a consequence? What would you think? Yeah, more of a punishment. Does it teach Rob anything? It doesn't. But what if I did this and just made a little twist? Rob, for the next 3 days, the expectation is for you to raise your hand with no talk. Then you can return to recess. Now what I've done is I've simply turned that into an action-oriented where Rob has to take action and he's learning a new skill or a different way to think. That makes sense? That's a great way to blend in some of the behavior components for a student, response to a student who comes from trauma. Here's another one. If you don't want to adjudicate the behavior, I would agree with that, but you're going to have to replace it with something. And you could replace it with something called the zone. And let me give you an example of Percone High School in Nashville that we worked on setting up a process called the zone in lieu of suspensions.
First, I'm going to read a quote. To succeed, you must first improve. To improve, you must first practice. Young people have to be given space to grow and to feel like, okay, I made a mistake, but from this learning experience, I can continue to become better. To learn, you must first fail.
When you're talking about student discipline, a lot of times we are punitive because it's faster and restorative takes more time. But restorative practices are better long-term. So at Procone, we have a place called the Zone, which we use in lieu of suspension.
Welcome to the Zone.
It's a collaborative space where kids get into a circle and they discuss what their behaviors were and ways to correct it.
We have the Zone every morning from 7 to 9 a.m. Today, we had 8 students in the Zone. We're here today to talk about how to make things right when we make mistakes, poor choices. Usually the infractions are cell phone use, disrespect, cursing, but it could also be that there was an argument in a classroom or more aggressive behaviors that also get sent to us. So even though you had a conflict that brought you here, if we can bring our best selves to this circle, we can get a lot done, we can learn from each other. When students come in, we go over circle guidelines so that there are agreements that we hold within this space. What does it mean to listen from the heart?
You're trying to feel like you're relating to the situation.
Just like showing respect to them.
Once we teach them really what the zone is and how this is not a space where there's a power dynamic between you and another person, then they kind of disarm and we get to what's causing that behavior.
I had somebody come to me and tell me that a friend said something bad about me.
Most of the time when you're in trouble, you get a referral and you have a consequence, they don't really want to hear your side of the story.
Well, what happened?
When you come into zone, they have a conversation with you and they kind of tell you how to solve your problem the positive way.
I was able to go to her and work it out.
We're really just trying to get context. Whenever there's a conflict, right, both parties contribute to the conflict, right? Although you may not feel like you contributed to the problem, you played a piece in it. And that's a part of the social emotional learning that we're trying to get them to see. We really want to have a discussion about the things you can control.
I just need to catch myself and know my surroundings.
It is a place for students to process their role in it, understanding who was harmed, but then also understanding that it's okay to reflect on what you as a student needed in that situation.
I don't need anything from others to make it right because I can be mature on my own.
But how can we help you in the maturing process? Because we're going to be here too. What I usually say is I don't want to change your behavior. I want you to think about it before you do it. Really, I've seen them becoming very intentional about what they do, what they say.
Everybody has to own up to their consequences.
And that's the whole purpose of the zone.
Me owning it, it's going to help me better.
All right, so in lieu of suspensions adjudicating behavior, what we try to do is integrate into the upstairs part of the brain and integrate from the right part of the brain to the left part of the brain. And we do that through strategies like the zone. Do you see how much more effective that can be than just suspensions or exclusionary practices, where once we begin to integrate the bottom to the top and the right to the left, they start to understand their impact that they had on their role in the behavior, and empathy and sympathy and all of that. What I want you to do is just for a minute, turn to somebody around you and talk about if we had something like the zone here at our elementary, middle, or high school, how would that change or possibly change some of the kids that we have up for suspension? Okay, so just have a conversation real quick. I want to hear what you think. Okay. Well, what do you think? Let's hear from you. And then also the elementary school as well, if they have any responses. How do you think the zone would change things? How does it fit into brain integration? How do you think it would change the impact on working with students that maybe right now are in trauma or have gone through developmental trauma? Maybe there's some egregious behavior, probably not now, but later on in the school year, and they're up for some adjudicated consequence like suspension. Did you talk about that at all? Maybe you didn't talk about it. Maybe you're like, hey, what are we doing for lunch? Okay, yeah.
I like how it gives students an opportunity to develop vocabulary and understanding for expressing, why it is they did what they did, and and trying to understand where other people are coming from. I think it's really, I like it. I think it's good.
Yeah, so developing a vocabulary and language to discuss and talk about what happened and their role in it and how to repair it and restore that relationship or whatever, right? Is that, yeah, and I wanted to repeat that for the elementary school, but that is integration. Isn't it integrating the right brain with the linguistics, the linguistics or language, the linear, the sequence, the logic of what happened? Yeah, so me and another kid beat the crap out of each other. That's why we're here at the zone. Now I have to work on integration so that that's what happened, the right part of the brain. Now I have to bring the language in and the logic and the sequence of the left part of the brain. That's called linking up and looking left. Linking up with the right brain, looking left to the left side of the brain. That's excellent. Yes?
And maybe it's because they had 2 hours with them, but I just found myself saying, how did they move the students from, well, that rule was stupid, or I didn't feel like doing that assignment, to actually taking ownership for what their infraction was?
Yeah. One is it takes a long time, doesn't it? Right? So the zone is occurring every day at school, and it's rotating enrollment. So there's some kids that are in, there's some kids that are not in. Right? You could be in for a day, you could be in for 2 days or 3 days, depending upon the infraction. Maybe you could be in longer, depending upon, has this connected with you yet? Right? And it's really hard for kids that come from trauma and toxicity for that to make a connection with that. So it doesn't just happen. It's not an overnight thing. It takes a long time to get there. And hold on to that question, because, by the way, I'm going to show you one of the recommendations then is to use victim-offender mediation meetings. You know why? Because the offender has to get to a point of realizing the hurt they caused. And that doesn't happen with one meeting and it's done. You'll have lots of meetings with this student. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so they're specifically trained in restorative practices, so that the bulk of it is restorative practices. And typically, it just varies. It could be a counselor, it could be a certified teacher that during that prep time they come in and they run a circle time. It could be an administrator as well. But they are definitely trained in restorative practices.
So that was one of the questions from elementary. And then the other, how have they gotten past the whole mindset from staff that there needs to be some consequence, that maybe they don't need to be in class or they need to be out of school, and changing that whole mindset? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think we get into it, I call it a trap. We get into a trap that if I'm not teaching this kid math or science or English language arts or whatever, I'm not teaching. And for these kids, that's backwards, because they will never be able to get and understand your content and master it until they get these skills first. So this becomes a priority. In fact, sort of, it doesn't happen this way, but the quicker we get brain integration, that we're a behavior farmer and a brain builder and a chicken psychologist, when we get that together, the faster they are to reach your curriculum. Think about it. Remember this. If you had Josh in your class who turtles, flips you off, throws something at you, puts his hoodie on and closes it, will totally destroy the classroom, you think he really is getting your English language arts lesson that day? Not a chance. Here's the thing, doesn't mean you're a rescuer. Doesn't even mean you're a therapist or that you're a counselor. It means you're a part of the process. And there's things you can do, little things here and there, that help to promote the integration. What I'm presenting to you today is my journey, my story. This is what I have found to work in working with these kids. You do whatever you want. This is what I have found to work as I've worked with these kids and worked with other districts, and I just want to pass it on to you. But I want to leave with this. You're a teacher. You're not a therapist. You're not a school counselor. You're not a clinical therapist. You are a part of the puzzle here. And all I'm presenting to you today is, one, understand about brain integration. Two, there are some pretty simple strategies that we can put into place to promote it. Because without brain integration, it's going to be hard to that has to come first before they can even master what you're teaching them. Does that make sense? That's got to make sense to some of you. So you have to sort of give yourself permission to say, okay, it's all right that I'm not teaching math to this kid right now. I'm putting that on the shelf. Doesn't mean we're never going to get there. We'll get there eventually, but right now I got to get him to a place where he can regulate. I got to get him to a place where he's paying attention and he's in the upstairs part of his brain. Right? Yes, sir. Well, it's a protocol approach as you're trained in restorative practices to get the student to a point in their thinking and understanding that they are not only the problem, they are the solution. And it's a process. It's not a one and done thing. It's just a process to go through. And this training isn't about that training, but that would be a kind of a unique training to go through. How do you get them to a point where they understand they're not only the problem, they're a solution? That's the key. They played a role in it. What role did they play? And they stop jabbing, justify, argue, and blame. Great question. It's just a process that takes time to get through. Remember, I said an overnight success takes about 3 to 5 years. That's an overnight. It's a crock-pot journey, not a microwave journey. Something like the zone is a part of the crock-pot journey. Something like, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't suspend kids and ultimately expel kids. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there are better ways to help change the ABCs, the attitude, the behavior, and the character. Especially kids that come from trauma, if we understand where they're coming from. Somebody had their hand up over here. Yes?
I have a question. I mean, we have an amazing special ed department here, and they're very overworked, stretched very thin.
Yeah.
As a special ed teacher yourself, how do you know, I feel like a lot of times that's their first go-to is to send them there, and that's where the child wants to go. So I guess as what is your experience working with the classroom teachers? Should they stay? Should they go? What do we do when the special ed department doesn't have anyone? So, I mean, I guess how do you work together and instead of just always sending them there, you know, what did you do when you were in special ed?
Well, that was, yeah, the question is, if I'm getting it right, is that a lot of times with difficult kids, we send them to the fix-it place. And the first thing in gen ed that we do is we send them to the fix-it place. We'll send them to the counselor, we'll send them to special ed, we'll send them out to alternative, we send them to the fix-it place. Would that be a fair assessment of what you're saying? How do we balance that? That special ed, you know, as everybody, overworked, too much on their plate, too stretched, all of that. And how do we balance that out? Leadership is the key there. And leadership says that it's not a special ed kid, it's not a general ed kid, it's our kid together. It's everybody's. That student is our student. I keep calling him kid. That student is our student. And we're all responsible for being invested in this student. That's number one. Because then it sort of breaks down the departmental barriers, right? And the departmental segmentations. That's the first thing. The second thing is this. I worked with a really challenging kid at Metamore High School, which is in Illinois. I'm not going to tell you his name because it's kind of close by here. But he was a high school student who came from trauma, had some pretty severe behavior, but would always flip his lid a lot. Great basketball player. I don't know who the basketball coach is here. I don't care. But the basketball coach took him out of the game and said, you're not playing the game until your shooting percentage increases. And the kid said to me one time, as I was counseling with him, he said, he told me the story about the basketball coach taking him out of the game and he's not going to play until his shooting percentage. He said, Mr. Dill, he said, Dr. Dill, how am I supposed to increase my shooting percentage when I'm not playing? Which resonated with me that sometimes what we'll do is we'll send kids out to different places and they're not on the court in the real game playing. And what I mean by that is this. The balance is that sometimes they definitely might need your support as a special educator, specifically designed instruction and services. But they also need to be on the court in the game because that's much different than when you're just on the court during practice and there's no audience, there's no time, there's not an opponent, there's nothing. So we put them into play, but we equip teachers so that they can navigate through this with students while they're in play. Does that make sense? It's a balance. That's how I have approached it. And the kid from Metamore High School put me on that journey, thinking about that. I don't want to suspend a kid. I want them here in play, on the court, but I need to equip and be teaching them skills. The easy way out, you take the easy way out, you're just going to suspend and expel a kid. I'm not saying there isn't merit for that, but if you choose not to move in different directions to promote integration and things like that, you're just choosing the easy way out. And it's easy because it's much more difficult. Look at all the questions already. Who does this zone? How are they trained? What's the time? How do we staff it? Who goes in there? When do they go in there? What's the curriculum? All that. It's more effort, but you have better results. Right? What I'm telling you today is not convenient, but in my journey, it's effective. All right. So at given time, we only have a couple minutes left, but there's some other responsive strategies. You could, as a teacher, use a commitment review conference. I like to use these on the fly. By the way, part of my responsive framework when I'm shifting through the 4 levels, you remember that, sneak in the humor, then might shift to setting limits based upon what the student, I might shift into this. This is probably going to happen when I have to set limits on Rob because he won't put his mask on. And I've already slipped in the humor. I snuck it in. Hey, Rob, let me see your mask. I'm getting old here. And Rob starts digging his heels. I might try to say, Rob, can you run down to Mrs. Johnson's, take this down to her? Thank you, buddy. I appreciate that. Hoping to reset him. He comes back and he's like in survival mode and has a Rob mask on. Or commitment review conference with me at noon. Now I just set the limit. That's called limit setting, sounding like Siri, looking like Queen Elizabeth. And I'm going to plug this in because this is a protocol approach to get to the root. And by the way, when I use a protocol approach like commitment review conferences, which you can see there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it helps me to stay out of traps when I meet with Rob at noon, like preaching to him, questioning him, and all of those traps that teachers get into. That's why in my journey, I use things like the commitment review conference. So when I meet with Rob at noon for a commitment conference because he didn't put his mask on, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to ask him these questions. Like, I'm going to go fishing. What were you doing? What were you doing in our science class when you were supposed to have your mask on? I'm not looking for him to say, yes, I was an idiot and I didn't put my mask on. What I'm looking for here is I'm looking for thinking patterns. That's what I'm fishing for. Because I already know he didn't put his mask on. And then I'm going to confront his thinking. Here's what I saw or what I heard. And then I'm going to challenge his thinking pattern. Challenge it. You know what challenging does? It helps to what? Integrate upstairs. I got to challenge it. Helps to integrate to the left. I've got to challenge it. I may say something like this. You know, Rob, it seems to be that when you don't get your way, the expectations about what happens in our science class seems to change for you. Who told you that would be a good idea not to put your mask on? Who gave you that idea? I want to challenge that thinking pattern. And then come the problem solving. What would you do differently? The next time we're in science class, what are you going to do differently? I'm going to try to front load it. And then come consequences or amends. Maybe he has to restore something. Maybe he has to write an apology letter. Maybe he has to repair something that he broke if he threw a fit in the classroom. Anyway, I can use this commitment review conference. All right. But I do want to get into these which are proactive. We only have a few minutes left. I've been through some of the responsive approaches to promoting integration. How about the proactive ones? How about when Rob is doing fine in my class, but he still comes from trauma? How can I promote or nudge integration? And there's a bucket of these. The first thing is this: I got to take care of myself, and you have to take care of you. This is called secondary trauma. There's a name for it. And I'm telling you, when you're dealing with a person like Rob, no, I'm just kidding. When you're dealing with a person like Natalie, a student like Natalie, and you have her in class every day, you're going to be prone to this secondary trauma. The body always keeps score. And you'll find yourself wore out, you can't sleep, you react to things very quickly, you jump to conclusions very quickly. So here are some things to help yourself think about taking care of yourself. Know your purpose. And I would tell you this, I know it's going to freak some of you out maybe, but it's okay, this is my journey. You're not here to teach science or math or computers or art or reading. That's not my purpose with somebody like Joshua. If that comes as a secondary thing, hallelujah. My purpose is to be a part of the healing process for him. That's my purpose. If you're like, I got to teach you reading, I got to teach you reading, I got to teach you math, I got to teach you math, we got to get to this, it's going to cause some turbulence and some chop. So know your purpose. Set some targets every day for yourself. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to be tolerant. I'm going to wait 5 seconds before I respond. I'm going to look like Queen Elizabeth. I'm going to sound like Siri. Set some little targets for yourself every day. Stay away from the Edos and the Ados. And I'm not kidding. Here's why. Because when you deal with a kid who is anxious, has a lot of trauma, is depressed, it sucks the life out of you. And here's the deal. Great teachers invest a lot, but it will suck it out of you. You need to stay healthy. And along with that, exercise your body, your mind, and I put secure good sleep. You have to work at it. You have to work at getting good rest. You have to work at it, secure it, go after it. Partner up. It's called collective impact. You cannot rescue this kid by yourself, but you can be a part of the healing process. Partner up and work as a team. You know what we would do, and I still do it? We would have weekly debriefing meetings, sometimes daily, where we just go in a room, close the door, and sort of like crack open a beer and let our hair down type of a deal, where we would just let it out. Because when we're in front of the kids, we have to keep it together. And that's partnering up. Use coping strategies. Know what your triggers are. If your triggers, meaning you're going to blow, if a kid turns to you and gives you guff, some teachers get triggered by this when a kid does a jeez. Some teachers flip out at that because they have a narrow tolerance range. Know your triggers. Be aware of them. and try to control them. Second, then, disengage or walk away. And the third is brush it and flush it. And brushing and flushing means this. Behavior issues and events will happen. When they're over, they are over. You brush it and flush it down the toilet, never think or talk about it again. Move on. The kiss of death for you in working with this kid every day, these kids every day that come from trauma and are in survival mode and have this, if you don't brush it and flush it, you'll keep marinating in it. When it's over, it's over. It's a new minute, a new hour, a new day, whatever. Move forward. Okay? All right. Try to develop a family-type culture. Here's the biochemical cascade with a family culture. Family culture, you can start doing a family culture, which I'm sure some of you do. It's not just being nice and kind. It's connecting with kids. Maybe you have a special handshake right before when they come through the door. You do before the door strategy, like, hey, how you doing? You and that student have a special handshake. Only you two know what that is. That's part of connection. It's part of being a family, right? The biochemical cascade that we're after here is it increases serotonin and dopamine, and it drives down cortisol and adrenaline, and then what happens is we increase executive function. This is a business type, and that'll do the opposite. You'll actually jack up cortisol and adrenaline, you'll drive down serotonin and dopamine, which actually tanks executive function. You want to engage the brain, not enrage the brain. And part of a little promoting is that type of culture. Create a classroom culture where kids can be vulnerable, feel worthy, and valued. And by the way, that comes from you as the leader in that classroom. Because I'm telling you, the scripts start early. The scripts of I'm not smart enough, cute enough, talented enough, tall enough, short enough, round enough, skinny enough, dark enough, light enough. It starts early. And do you ever have any kids that have motivation issues? Have you ever gone to a meeting where you're like, this kid isn't motivated, I can't get him to do anything? That's your problem. It is. Do all the research you want. I've already done it for you. All the research on motivation boils down to right there. They are invulnerable, they don't feel worthy, and they have shame scripts running in their head. Yes, ma'am. What'd you say? So part of that is, oh man, there's lots of different things. You could do this as a bullet. Oh yeah. So she said, short of just building them up every day by giving commendations to them verbally, like, great job, I love the way you did that, that type of thing. And by the way, you have to make sure that's authentic, right? We don't want them to get to a point where they think this is just fake news, that she says it every day, doesn't really mean it. So how do you do that? Have lunch with them. Have meeting times with them. Get to know them. Have them get to know you. Share their interest with you and share your interest with them. Play games with them. Take time to just sit and play games. Get to know them. It's inconvenient. By the way, you have a millisecond, and you guys probably know this, but I know we're out of time, but you have a millisecond, or close to being out of time. You have a millisecond for their brain to register whether they're going to trust you or not. Like, it's less than a second. It's a fraction of a second. So it's not, you're right, it's not just in class giving them accommodations. It goes well beyond that. And that's, Rob and I talk about relationship to relationship, relationship. It's about that. It's about connecting with them, right? And when they finally connect with you, meaning they trust you, they become more vulnerable in your class. You know, there's some other things you can do too, and as we wrap up here, remember this, teach like a Twizzler. I call it the Twizzler teaching approach, which is, if you've ever eaten a Twizzler, it's firm yet flexible. Students who come from trauma, and most every student really connect with a Twizzler teacher because they're firm, they're consistent, which builds trust over time, but they're also flexible. That doesn't mean you are weak and permissive when behavior happens. It means you're flexible, you're shifty in your response, right? That's called the Twizzler teaching approach. There's some other things. One is, here's another way how I can help with that value and worthiness. Don't nitpick on every little thing. I'm not sure if any of you middle school and high school teachers still have a red pen that you mark on, and that's okay if you do, but I'm telling you, kids that come from trauma, if you mark on their paper with a red pen, you know what they'll call you? A prick. Because what you will do is you'll nitpick on every little thing. I'm just being real with you. Reinforce progress and process. That helps to build trust. It helps promote the vulnerability. Do some nudging strategies. I talked to you about, outside the door when they come in, have that special handshake with the kid, just you and them know it, right? That's a connection. But you can use commitment lines. Commitment lines are great. Here's why commitment lines help with promoting integration, because you're tapping into the upstairs part of their brain, and you're front-loading with a commitment. If the brain makes a commitment, it's less likely to default on the commitment. So they're called commitment lines. Notice I said a commitment review conference. Commitment lines are great. We've used them from early childhood, from 3 to 5-year-olds, all the way up to high school kids. Here's a commitment line. Maybe I did this last year, I can't remember. Let's say this is the door to my classroom. Oh, they can't see me with the cameras, can they? I don't know if they can see me out there. All right, let's say this is the door to my classroom. And I'm doing before the door strategies. The bell's about to ring, all the kids are coming, they're lining up, and right before we go into class, I'm going to say to my freshmen, to my sophomores, to my 7th graders, it doesn't matter. Hey guys, before we go and line up in 2 lines. Behind my right hand, in front of my right hand, in front of my left hand. In front of my right hand, those of you are going to follow expectations today during our lesson, because we have a pretty difficult lesson. In front of my left hand, those of you who are going to goof off and not follow expectations. Which one do you want to get into? Because that is a commitment nudge. When the brain makes a commitment, it's less likely to default. By the way, think about that. I can use it for elementary, for example, before we go to lunch, before we go to recess, before they leave home. Hey guys, grab your book bags, grab your gloves, grab your mittens, grab your hats, grab your coats. Oh, before we dismiss, got your backpack? Before we dismiss, hop in 2 lines. Those of you are going to decide to do your homework, those of you are going to choose not to. Which one you want to get into? Right? Yes?
What do you do with the ones that choose to misbehave?
Yeah, then that's a great question. So then you go into your responsive process, right? So you go into your response. There's 4 levels. So depending upon that student and how, maybe they hopped over into the left lane, I would say, everybody else kind of go in and get to your desk. I have a homework assignment for you to start working on. I'll be in there in a minute. Guess who's going to be out in the hallway because they decided to get into the other line? Joshua. And what are you going to do with Joshua? I think, okay, commitment review conference. Joshua, tell me what was going on there. Why did you decide to get in this line? And you just go right through your protocol. Right? That's a good question. Yes?
How do you work with a student that their survival mode is street smarts in the sense of knowing what to say in those conferences, and like they have the right things to say, but the behavior doesn't change?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, because have you worked with kids that come from trauma before? You have. And you know that they might, are you a high school teacher? Yeah. These kids are 16, 17, 18 years old with a developmental age of 10, right? And a street smart age of 25 or 30. Would you agree? Yeah, that's where we get that from. So in the conferences, the kids know what to say. What is that? Tactic. That's why you have to be prepared. That is a tactic. Tactics are used to what? That's why you have to know this. To wear you out, to confuse you, and to avoid accountability. Those are tactics. And they're also part of the jab. I'm guessing they justify, they argue, and they blame. Because they typically do. So in my mind, if I were walking in your shoes, I had a commitment review conference with a kid or a victim offender mediation meeting with a kid, and they started giving me language that they know can help them navigate through because they're street smart, it's a tactic. That still doesn't mean that I don't hold them accountable. I hold them accountable. What do I hold them accountable with? Consequences that don't adjudicate the behavior, consequences that change the way they think or give them a new skill. I mean, a kid like Natalie, when you talk to Natalie in a conference like that, don't ever ask her, what do you think you should be doing? Because what is she going to tell you? Exactly what you want to hear. And then you're going to think, okay, well, she's on the right road. And then the second she walks out of there, you're going to have blowback. You're going to be right back into that conference with her because she's going to behave the way she does again. You know why? Because she's stuck in the basement, right? That's a great question because that's the difference between being a strong-willed, like Maddie, who went, and being maladaptive, like my daughter, Al-Qaeda Kennedy, with maladaptive thinking patterns, and being a kid who comes from developmental trauma. That's the difference. That's a great question. I would chalk it up as it's a trap, or it's a tactic. I still hold them accountable. And you know how you do that? I'll tell you how to do it. When you're in a conference with those kids, what do you do? Are you a teacher or a counselor? Teacher. What do you teach? High school science. When you're in a commitment review conference, if you choose to do that with a student or a victim offender mediation meeting, and your signal in your brain's going, this kid's giving me tactics. He's telling me what I want to hear. He's telling me the words. Understanding your brain is a tactic, and then you use two words which are diffusers. And I taught them to you last year, hopefully, I think. You remember what they are? Regardless and nevertheless. Because when that kid's using a tactic and he or she is telling you what you want to hear, you challenge it by using a diffuser and you say, regardless, here's what you chose to do. Nevertheless, here's what you chose to do. Because the simpleness of this is they either chose to meet expectations or not. So they either chose to meet expectations or not. And so you can recognize it as a tactic and use a diffuser like nevertheless or regardless. It's a good question. All right. Here's some other ones, and then I know we're going to end here. And by the way, this PowerPoint, I just use it as a guide for us today. You can use things to nudge them, like plussing. Plussing, for example, is used when you, as a teacher, use the words and what if more than you use the words but. And by the way, there's a company out there that uses plussing a lot so that their creators can be more creative, and the company's called Disney. And Disney came up with this thing called plussing, and we use it in schools. Because remember the vulnerability, and I'm not smart enough, I'm not creative enough, I'm not good enough. If a kid comes up to you and you say, let me see your first page of your paper. Oh, it's interesting in here. What? But you can't have the main character die in the first paragraph. Plussing would substitute that with, oh, it's interesting, you have your main character die in the first paragraph of your story. And I wonder if, or I wonder what would happen if, right? You're just plussing. All right. There's some other ones in here as well. And the last one is this. Sometimes you're not a science teacher or a math teacher or an English language arts teacher or a PE teacher or an art teacher. Sometimes you're a social-emotional learning teacher. And so part of promoting brain integration is to teach social-emotional competence. Teach them about the brain. Teach them about the amygdala. Teach them the language of what's happening to them. The more information and knowledge they have, the better they are to then gain the skills. And there's a couple of different ways we can do that. I mean, we can teach I teach what it's like to flip their lid, and I use my hand. This is the basement of your brain. This is the top of your brain, up here, the upstairs. And the upstairs part of your brain is designed to control and monitor the downstairs part of your brain. But sometimes you lose it. And the upstairs goes away, and just what's left is the downstairs brain, and that's when you destroy the classroom. And my goal is for them to understand what's happening in their head, but then the next time they start to feel this, that maybe they go to a reset zone or a reset place, right? For high school, middle school and high school, I think one of the most practical, effective SEL curriculums to use if you do circle time, you do the zone, for example, is Highly Effective Habits of Teenagers by Covey. That's a great one. And then using restorative practices. Because a lot of times with kids that come from trauma, they're in survival mode, and it's that 2 a.m. bleacher brain, if you remember. So the behavior happens, and then we have to work on restoring and repairing. And the approaches that I have found to be the most effective are restorative type of approaches. Classroom circles, VOM meetings, victor offender mediation meetings, those types of things, where they come to a realization of the hurt they caused and the role they play in it, which then helps to heal and promotes integration and then gives them a plan for what to do different the next time. So, all right, I know we're out of time.
Hey, Kevin, real quick.
Yeah, I wanted to open up for questions.
A couple of questions from the elementary. The first one, while you're regulating a student, what do you do with the other students in the room?
So, okay, so it doesn't matter which grade level. I was going to ask which grade level, but it kind of does. You can either isolate that student or remove that student, the one that's regulating. The preference would be that if you can catch the going into dysregulation early enough, you could remove them from, move them to the back of the room to a reset corner or something like that, or I call it a corner, a reset space, where there are some sensory type activities to help de-escalate or escalate. Sometimes they're running low and you need to escalate. If they just flip their lid like this, boom, and it came out of nowhere, and they're destroying the classroom and you're trying to get them regulated, you have a choice of either isolating them or removing them. So if you try to remove them, sometimes what happens is they go into turtling mode. Turtling mode is when they'll climb under a desk or a chair or something like that. They'll go into the coat closet, something like that, right? That's called turtling. And they're like, over my dead body am I moving out of this classroom. So then you're left with isolation. And how you use isolation is you do this. You go over to your phone. I'm going to pretend this is a phone. You go over to your phone, call the office. You say, Jill, can you remind the staff there's a staff meeting at room 1A after school today? Thank you. Jill comes over the phone, the intercom, your secretary, and says this. Pardon the interruption. I want to remind staff there's a staff meeting in room 1A after school today. Room 1A. Thank you. That's the signal. Anybody not working with a student drops what they're doing and they walk to room 1A. And as they're walking to room 1A, they're looking for any empty rooms. Okay, I'm walking to room 1A. Okay, the cafeteria is open, Brabson's room is open, the tech lab is open. When I get to room 1A, the first person there is the team leader. And believe me, people walk really slow to room 1A. They stop and get a drink and check their hair. They don't want to be the team leader because there's some responsibilities. But here's how you isolate effectively. I'm just answering the question. So the first person at the door turns around in the hallway and waits for the other people to come. And by the way, it could be one other person, it could be 10, it could be 100. You don't know. When those people come up to you, they're telling you empty rooms. So Brabson's room is open, the tech lab is open, the cafeteria is open. And then you say this to them. Let's say this is the hallways. Okay, you guys ready? Brabson's room is open, the tech lab is open, and what else? Oh, the library is open. Okay, are you guys ready? All right, let's go. And you come through the door. When you come through the door, you flood it with positives. And it sounds like this. It's crazy, but it sounds like this. I'm going to put my mask on for this. Okay, you guys ready to go? We got Brabson's room is open, science lab is open, the tech lab is open. What else? Oh, the library is open. You ready to go? Okay, let's go. Hey, how you doing, guys? It's good to see you. How are you? I love that red jacket. That's awesome. Oh, don't touch me if I get a virus. I love that mask. That is awesome. I love your new glasses. Would you like that? What are you drinking in there? What is that, huh? Are you sure it's water? I don't believe you one bit. I don't think it's water. I love that mask. What is that? Is that I can't remember, what is that, a joke or a rabbit? You got a mustache. Do you really have a mustache? I saw you at the football game the other night. Okay. That's flooding. Oops, sorry. I didn't have my microphone on and you could hear me. That's called flooding, and what I'm doing is shocking the conscience of everybody in there because they're like, what in the world? And think about it, you have 10 people coming in flooding. So you have Rob over here who's under the table. I know I need to regulate Rob, but I couldn't remove him, so I go into isolation. Now I have to isolate Rob. So I call the team, Jill, tell everybody there's staffing in room 1A after school. People who are not in charge of kids walk to room 1A. They look for empty rooms. They get to room 1A, the team leader is the first person. Their job is to get the information from people in the hallway about what rooms are available. Then they flood. How you doing? It's good to see you. Saw the people go, oh, did you watch that movie? I love those classes. We're just flooding. It's crazy. And then the team leader turns to the teacher and asks 2 questions. Who's the student? What was the last expectation? They have to know who the student is. And the teacher would say, it's Rob. What was the last expectation? To go to Mr. Dill's office. And guess what? It's always that. The only time you're going to remove a student to isolate them is when the last expectation was for them to go to the counselor's office or Mr. Dill's office. So it's always going to be that. Right? And then what happens is the team leader takes over, turns to the teacher, asks the question, who's the student? What was the last expectation? It was Rob, supposed to go to the principal's office. Okay, how you doing? It's good to see you. Rob, office. It's good to see you. I love your earrings. And here's what I'm doing. I'm counting. 1, 2. It's good to see you. I love that striped shirt. You kind of look like a zebra. I love zebras. That's Rob, Mr. Dill's office. I love zebras. Have you seen, what is that new movie? What's that called? I can't remember. Zebra Stripes or something like that? Rob, office. I can't remember. Did you ever see that movie before? Have you seen it? Have you ever eaten spaghetti and meatballs? You have? Tonight I'm going to eat at an Italian restaurant. I heard the meatballs are as huge as bowling balls. They're huge. I turned to the teacher after 2 precision commands to Rob, and I counted 5 long seconds between each one. As I'm interfacing with her, keeping her mind in the upstairs. And then I turn to the teacher and I say, Brabson's room is open, the tech lab is open, and the library is open. And the teacher does this. Class, line up, hands to self, single file, let's head to the tech lab. Let's go. And everybody lines up, and I, as the teacher, lead in the tech lab, and we continue instruction. And then I've isolated Rob by removing you, but here's the catch. The great thing about that strategy or that process is I keep instruction going for you as much as possible in the tech lab. And the rest of us remain to regulate Rob. Does that make sense? And by the way, if you adopt a strategy like that or a process like that, you have to practice it with your staff during days like this, because if you don't practice this, here's what will happen. Pardon the interruption. I want to remind staff there's a staff meeting in room 1A after school, and you'll have people show up in room 1A after school. That has happened, and they'll be like, does he have cookies? Did Rob put out cookies? He always put out cookies for staff meeting. So, long-winded answer to a question about, I'm in the mix, in the thick of this, and I got to regulate a kid who has flipped their lid and in the basement of their brain, and I'm in the response mode, the 4th level. How do I regulate them when I've got 25 other kids? And you either do it by removing or isolation, one or the other. So, all right, any other questions? I promise the next answer will not be as long as that. But hopefully that kind of gave you an idea. But did you have fun today? Did you learn some things? Hopefully you found some things interesting and are connecting with what you've already learned and building upon that. So, all right, Rob, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
So as Kevin was talking, I just wrote down a few things that I'm going to keep in mind as we move forward. As throughout the conversation or throughout his presentation, I could see 5 or 6 students that were repeat visitors down to the office with Mr. Compton and myself back in the day, and even it goes back to teaching those few people. So I know you all are probably doing the same. And then I don't know what it is with the name Josh. He brings it up, and then I think we all have had a Josh in class. So just a few things that I wrote down. Conflict is inevitable. Combat's optional. I know he said it last year. Stop the dog from barking. Reinforce versus reward. More is caught than taught. When things get shaky, you get shifty. And then on the court and in the game, engage, don't enrage, and brush and flush. I think those kind of, in a nutshell, things that we need to take. And I think we just need to spend time moving forward to kind of think outside the box on how we can implement some of these, not only in our classroom, but school-wide. I mean, when you think about it, and I've always said this, what is it, 5 or 10% that we allow to kind of drag us down? And we know that there are reasons why they're behaving the way they do, and we just have to try to put strategies in place to not get to where they're dragging us down, that we can see. And, there's a lot of times that we do make that change, and you see them, 2 or 3 years after they graduate, and they're successful out in the real world. But it's taken a lot of time and effort to get there. But we also know we failed that many more too. So we'll continue to work on this and continue to focus on it. For the rest of the day, I know each building's kind of a little bit different, but I think Mrs. Taylor helped coordinate pizzas in each of the buildings, and then we're going to give you time to do the safe school training. Those that are returning, not near as much time and effort on some of the modules as those new teachers. So there's a little bit of deadlines there that are a little different, and that was communicated yesterday. But I do appreciate the time and effort spent today. Kevin, thank you again. Always great to see you and hear you. I think, is this your first time coming out on a visit since COVID? Mainly online, so hopefully you get more out and about now. So, but thank you all 3 buildings, and have a great rest of the day. And you know where I'm at if you need me. So thank you all again.
Okay, a few things before we release for lunch. Mr. Ramey kind of stole what I was going to say to you a little bit, but take some time this afternoon to debrief with yourself a little bit. There's so much today that makes sense to us that we may use already, you may do naturally, but there's probably some things that came up today you're thinking, yeah, I could use that a little bit. So go through, debrief, go through your notes, write down about 3 things that you think you may go ahead and use. And then Tuck doesn't know it yet, but we're going to do a follow-up to this and try to keep that fresh in our minds as we go through the rest of the year. I know for me, coordinating behavior responses, Julie's question really got me thinking, are we doing everything we can do when we have these kids that need regulated? Are we doing everything we can do consistently through the 7 class periods they're in to try to modify that behavior? The zone meetings, is that something we can do as part of our Friday schools? Something we thought about. A lot of our suspensions are for what we call deal breakers: alcohol, drugs, fights, those kinds of things. But can we modify? Can we make a zone meeting something we incorporate as part of a Friday school? So.
It's not always just their job to do it. be dealing with the behavior too. And I know you're all capable of doing it, and I know it's easier to just say, hey, let it be somebody else's problem. I see that the elementaries too. Come get this kid, I'm about to lose it. Well, why is the kid why is he doing it? We need to figure out ourselves how we can regulate ourselves in order to deal with that too.
No, and that brings up another point I've been thinking about a little bit through this presentation. I feel like the special education students, we've kind of got a plan with them, and we have a case conference every year, and we communicate behavior plans if we have those in place. How many gen ed kids do we have that are not regulated, and that we're missing in some way? So that's another thought I had there. So those are the three things I'm going to try to think about a little bit, building wide. But I want all of you to try this afternoon, hey, what three things do you think you picked up on today that you're going to use? And then we may try to kind of circle back on a Wednesday morning and bring these up a little bit. As Mr. Ramey said, lunch will be provided. Grade level meetings, we've got those scheduled to start at 11:45. Let's go ahead and start those at 11:55, just before noon. Start your grade level meetings. Chris sent out instructions today or yesterday about what to do at your grade level meetings. We need to go ahead and get homerooms set up. If things are going well, we'll see at fall break. I'll make a determination, and we'll figure out when we're going to implement homerooms. So go ahead and get those set up. And we need student of the month. So those are the two things. So just work through that. Now, the question came up from Mr. Brunny, I think, asked the question. Great question. The full-time online kids, do they get a homeroom? Yes, I think we've got to go ahead and draft them and put them in a homeroom. We don't know how long. We don't know necessarily second semester if we'll have online learning or not. So they're going to need a place. They're also going to need to log on if we do have homerooms. We don't want to just give them 25 minutes during the day when they're not connected with us. So go ahead and draft the online kids as well. Safe school training should start around 12:30. It could be a little bit later by the time you get out of those grade level meetings. The one you got to make sure you do today is the test security training. Do that. Chris has a sign-off sheet in your mailboxes. You need to make sure after you do the test security training that you find that sign-off sheet, get it to Chris before you leave today. Anything I missed with that, Chris? To initial at the bottom of the sign-off? Okay. Okay. Gotcha. English teachers, you know what you're doing at 1 o'clock, diving into the curriculum resources a little bit. So that's a little change from the agenda. Math teachers, you are not doing the NWEA data today. Just go ahead and do your Safe School modules and finish through those. Office hours, 1:45. Make sure you're checking in, see if kids have questions. Answer questions tomorrow. The assignments are due, the e-learning assignments from today are due at 3 o'clock on Friday. Okay? Any questions about anything before we release to lunch? Chris, anything with grade level meetings I forgot? Okay. All right, let's go have lunch, and then we'll start with our grade level meetings about 11:55.